Chapter 59. The reason why Su Zimo did not leave Pingyang Town immediately was that he wanted to wait for Zhou Dingyun. If Zhou Dingyun returned to Pingyang Town and could not find Su Zimo, he would definitely shift his target to the Su family. The emperor's edict had a great deterrent effect on the various vassal states. It might not be useful to the Qi refinement warriors, let alone the disciples of Iridescent Cloud's palace, one of the 5 major sections. Su Zimo could not leave with peace of mind if Zhou Dingyun was not dead. Just like what Su Zimo said to Zhou Dingyun, from the moment he let him go, he knew that he would come back. It was just that Su Zimo did not know when Zhou Dingyun would come back. But he was willing to wait. Perhaps it was because he was worried about Zhou Dingyun, or perhaps it was because he was reluctant to part with the mansion, the cultivation field, and someone else. He waited for half a year. For the past half a year, Su Zimo was not in a hurry to cultivate the 4th section of the 12 demons of the Great Wilderness, marrow cleansing. Instead, he continued to cultivate the first 3 sections of the body tempering, tendons transformation, and bone strengthening to strengthen his body and spirit. He continued to refine the essence sealed in the scarlet flame fruit in his body. Su Zimo's realm had improved significantly. He was close to achieving phenomenal success in the first 3 sections. In his free time, Su Zimo would also practice his archery in the cultivation field. He was able to shoot more than 10 arrows at the heart. This was the result of half a year of hard work in archery. After killing Zhou Dingyun, Su Zimo no longer had any reason to stay in Pingyang Town. Instead, he felt an inexplicable sense of loss. Su Zimo returned to the mansion. He stood at the door and looked at the peach blossom tree not far away. His eyes were in a daze and he did not want to leave for a long time. The dark clouds dispersed and the moonlight was like water. The peach blossoms fell one after another. It was just like that night 2 years ago. It was just that the person was not around. Su Zimo recalled a poem that he had read before. Last year in this sect on this day, the human face and peach blossoms reflected each other. The human face was nowhere to be seen, but the peach blossoms were still smiling in the spring breeze. When he was young, Su Zimo did not understand the concept in these 4 lines of the poem. But now, Su Zimo was 19 years old, and the immaturity on his face was gradually disappearing. He finally experienced the melancholy of things being the same but people being different. Su Zimo would never forget that night, when he was at his most frustrated, confused, and helpless. A woman stood among the falling peach blossoms and led him onto the path of cultivation. Su Zimo smiled, stretched out his hands, and slowly closed the door of the mansion. The closed door not only locked up the mansion, but also locked up an incomparably precious memory for Su Zimo. Only when he reunited with that person would the door of memories open. Su Zimo was looking forward to that day. Su Zimo took a deep breath after a long time, and his eyes regained their clarity. He took out an animal skin map from his bosom, and carefully identified it. Then, he walked in a certain direction with large strides. Behind him a ray of light broke through the mist. The sun rose from the east. A new day had begun. In the southwest of the Great Zhou dynasty, there was a region nearby that was extremely famous. This place was shrouded in thick fog all year round. From afar, it looked as if it was enveloped by countless unpredictable clouds. It was ethereal and otherworldly. Busybodies would enter the thick fog to check out what was going on, but they would return to the same place before long. Over time, the nearby villagers also realized that this was a place where immortals lived. Mortals were not allowed to come close. Every year, there would be a few days in the thick fog when a mountain peak could be vaguely seen. It towered into the clouds and was majestic. Every time this happened, the nearby villagers would kneel in the direction of the mountain peak and pray that the weather would be good this year and that they would be healthy. This day, a green-robed scholar came to this place. It was not accurate to call him a scholar. This person had a delicate face, but he had a long saber tied to his waist and a blood-colored bow slung over his shoulder. His attire was rather unique. This green-robed scholar was none other than Su Zimo, who had left Pingyang Town. Ji Yaoshua had guessed correctly. Su Zimo indeed wanted to enter Misty Peak. On one hand, Misty Peak was mysterious in Ji Yaoshua's eyes. There must be something extraordinary about it. On the other hand, Misty Peak was the closest to the country of Yan. If something happened, Su Zimo could rush back immediately. However, on the map, Only a rough location of Misty Peak was marked. When Suzimo arrived, he could not find the location of Misty Peak despite being in the thick fog. Suzimo walked for a day and returned to the same spot several times. He could not find a clue. In this thick fog, visibility was extremely low. Even with Suzimo's eyesight, he could only see a distance of 10 meters. This place was like a maze. He walked around in circles in the thick fog but could not find the exit. Strange. Suzimo returned to the same spot. He stared at the fog not far away from him, frowning and deep in thought. Ji Yaoshua had once told him that it was much harder to enter Misty Peak than other sections. Not only did it depend on one's spirit root and the grade of one's spirit root, there were also other obstacles. Even many advanced Qi refinement warriors could not join Misty Peak. However, this was also what attracted Suzimo to Misty Peak. If it was like iridescent cloud's palace, which only looked at the quality of one's spirit root, Suzimo would not be surprised by such a sect. It seems that I will have to put in a lot of effort to enter Misty Peak. Suzimo vaguely guessed that the thick fog in front of him might be the first obstacle to entering Misty Peak. If he could not pass this obstacle, he might not even be able to see the real Misty Peak, let alone enter the sect. Seeing that the sky was getting dark, Suzimo planned to find a place to rest for the night and think of a way to get out of this situation. He would make plans the next morning. The fog in front of him must be something special. It was definitely not a solution to barge in blindly. There was a small village not far from here. A woman was preparing dinner, a burly man was returning from chopping firewood, a hunter was returning home with his prey, 2 old men were squatting at the entrance of the village, playing chess with a chessboard in front of them. There were also children chasing and playing in the village. It was a joyous and harmonious scene. At the sight of this scene, Suzimo felt a sense of warmth. He revealed a smile and walked briskly towards the village. "Uncle, I am Suzimo from the country of Yan. I don't have a place to stay tonight. Can I stay here for the night?" Suzimo came to the entrance of the village, bowed and asked the 2 old men who were playing chess. The 2 old men did not seem to hear him. They seemed to be immersed in the game and could not be distracted. Suzimo coughed softly and asked again. The 2 old men still did not speak. They each held a chess piece and stared intently at the chessboard. Occasionally, they would place a piece with a dignified expression. Suzimo was a little embarrassed. The 2 old men did not respond. Suzimo's rash entrance to the village was a little impolite. Suzimo smiled and turned to leave. With his ability, he could spend the night anywhere with the sky as his blanket and the earth as his bed. The reason why he wanted to stay in the village was that Suzimo felt the warmth of the human world that he had not seen for a long time. Suzimo was about to leave when his gaze inadvertently fell on the chessboard of the 2 old men and gradually froze. The game was very intense. Both sides were in a stalemate. Every time a piece was placed, the slightest mistake would result in the loss of the game. Suzimo thought that since he had nothing to do, he might as well watch the game before leaving. He stood aside and watched the game. Chapter 60. After a long time, the 2 sides finished their game. The defeated old man waved his hand dispiritedly and muttered, "I'm not in a good mood today. I'll let you win 1 game. We'll fight again tomorrow." The old man walked back to the village with his hands behind his back. The remaining old man had rosy cheeks and looked hale and hearty. As he tidied up the chessboard, he looked up at Suzimo and said with a smile, "There aren't many young people like you who are calm and collected. Come, follow me into the village." "Thank you, uncle." Suzimo smiled and thanked him. He followed the old man into the village. The villagers passing by just glanced at Suzimo and looked away. They didn't seem to be surprised. "There are no extra rooms here. Young man, you can stay in the woodshed, right?" the old man asked. "No problem," Suzimo replied with a smile. Night had just fallen. Most of the people in the village hadn't slept yet. The old people who had eaten dinner were taking a leisurely stroll in the village. The women were sewing clothes with needles and thread. Simple and peaceful. This place was like an otherworldly paradise. There was no killing, no fighting, but everyone had a happy and satisfied smile on their faces. Suzimo sat at the door of the woodshed and watched this scene quietly. He emptied his mind and didn't think about anything. The fatigue of the journey seemed to have lessened a lot. The night was getting darker. The moon was bright and the stars were few. The old people, women, and men had all returned to their houses to rest. In the village, only some energetic children were still playing and didn't want to go home to sleep. Suzimo stood up and returned to the woodshed. He closed the door and was about to rest. At this moment, a young child's voice came from the village. It was crisp and pleasant. "Where can I find the immortal trace?" Looking at the misty peak from afar, "It's only in this mountain deep in the clouds." Suzimo's heart skipped a beat. He suddenly turned around, pushed the door open, and looked in the direction of the voice. Not far away, a 7 or 8-year-old child with a smile on his face was skipping over. Suzimo thought for a moment and walked up to him. He squatted down and asked with a smile, "Child, who said that just now?" "Who said that?" The child tilted his head and blinked his big watery eyes. He seemed a little confused and said, "I don't know, but we can all say it." "Is it just a simple nursery rhyme?" Suzimo pondered. "Big brother, you want to cultivate and seek the Tao, right?" The child asked again. "Yes." Suzimo nodded and asked with a smile, "How did you know?" A hint of cunning flashed through the child's eyes. He stuck out his tongue and said, "There are people like you every year, but most of them don't get to see immortals. How can I meet her?" Suzimo's interest was piqued and he wanted to tease the child. "I don't know either." The child pouted and shook his head. Suzimo smiled. Just as he was about to get up and leave, an idea suddenly flashed through his mind. He looked at the child and asked, "Where can I find the fairy's trace? I can see the misty peak from afar, but the misty peak is shrouded in fog. How can I see it?" "That's easy." The child proudly raised his chin and said, "After a few days, the fog will dissipate a little. Standing here, you will be able to faintly see a part of the peak. But it's only for 3 days. If you miss it, you won't be able to see it." Suzimo was overjoyed. As long as he could see the misty peak and follow the misty peak's direction, he would definitely be able to reach the foot of the mountain. Of course, Suzimo didn't think that entering the misty peak was as simple as passing through the fog. But this was the prerequisite. Suzimo stayed in the village for 7 days. On the 7th day, the fog gradually dissipated. A towering mountain peak was faintly discernible in the distant clouds. Suzimo bid farewell to everyone in the village and once again stepped into the fog. In the fog, all of his senses were lowered to the limit and his sense of direction was blurred. Suzimo felt like he was turning east and west. Sometimes he even felt like he was going back the way he came. Due to the dissipation of the fog, he could still see the position of the mountain peak clearly even in the fog. Suzimo ignored everything and tried his best to ignore the illusion brought about by his senses. He merely followed the direction of the mountain peak and walked forward. All of a suddenly a rustling sound came from the depths of the fog. It was eerie and terrifying, as though a spirit beast was walking and stepping on the grass. It was getting closer and closer. A faint stench of blood wafted over. Suzimo narrowed his eyes and stopped in his tracks, looking in the direction of the sound. After waiting for a long time, no spirit beast appeared. It was a strange feeling. Suzimo didn't sense any danger with his spirit perception. However, there was indeed the sound and aura of a spirit beast coming from that direction. Suzimo had lived in Songlang mountain range for a year, and was all too familiar with the smell. There was no mistaking it. "Strange," Suzimo murmured softly and continued walking forward. Roar! Not long after, a tiger's roar sounded from the front. It was deafening and had a strong aura. It was clear that the spirit beast was powerful, and could even be at the level of a spirit demon. Suzimo frowned. Logically speaking, if a powerful spirit beast or spirit demon appeared before him, Suzimo should have sensed danger with his spirit perception. However, the strange thing was that there was no reaction from his spirit perception. However, his 5 senses could sense danger time and time again. There were only 2 possibilities for such a situation. The fog in the surroundings could either hide from Suzimo's spirit perception, or confuse his 5 senses. The answer was obvious. Those methods were nothing more than to scare off those who wanted to cultivate immortality and Tao, but had weak willpower. The tiger's roar and the stench of blood were nothing more than methods to confuse people. After understanding the purpose of the fog, Suzimo smiled and ignored the various movements around him as he walked into the depths of the fog. No matter what, the fog was rather brilliant for it to confuse a person's five senses. If not for the fact that Suzimo had spirit perception, he would have been treading carefully along the way. Suzimo gradually quickened his footsteps. Before long, he rushed out of the fog and everything before him opened up. At a glance, the vegetation was lush and lush. Green water surrounded the mountains and everything was full of life, as though he was in an immortal realm. Not far away there was a stone door. Behind the stone door was a mountain path paved with green stones. It twisted and turned, leading to the darkness of the fog. On both sides of the stone door stood two young Dao children. One was fat and the other was skinny. They had rosy lips and white teeth. When the fat Dao child caught sight of Suzimo, he smiled and nodded, saying, "Young master, you're the first one. Please wait here for a moment. The sect will only open 3 days later to accept disciples." Suzimo was not in a hurry as well as he waited quietly at the side. People walked out of the fog continuously. Most of them were mortals who had never cultivated before. Their faces were pale and their foreheads were covered in sweat. It was clear that they had suffered quite a shock along the way. In the middle, there were also Qi refinement warriors who broke through the fog on their flying swords. They heaved a sigh of relief when they saw the stone door. Some of the Qi refinement warriors swept their gazes across Suzimo. When they did not detect any spirit Qi fluctuation, their expressions relaxed slightly. A few Qi refinement warriors could not help but sneer when they saw Suzimo's attire with a bow and saber on his back. There were all kinds of people. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. Chapter 61. In 3 days, more than 500 people had gathered in front of the stone gate. Most of them were mortals who had never cultivated before, and there were dozens of Qi refinement warriors among them. After 3 days, the fog behind everyone thickened once more, and they could no longer see. Even if there were people outside who wanted to join Misty Peak, they would have to wait until next year. For 3 whole days, even the 2 Dao children standing beside the stone gate could not hide their fatigue, let alone the 500 people in front of the stone gate. They stood at a corner and chatted casually. "Senior brother, how many of the 500 people do you think will join the sect?" "At most 5. In this vast forest, the sound of birds chirping and flowing water could be heard continuously. The discussion of the 2 Dao children was as soft as a mosquito, and no one could hear it clearly. However, in the crowd, a green-robed scholar with a bow and saber on his back frowned and a look of shock flashed through his eyes. Cultivating the mystic classic of the 12 demon kings of the great wilderness did not only change one's physical body. Cultivating the body tempering section would improve one's sense of smell. Cultivating the tendons transformation section would improve one's vision, and cultivating the bone strengthening section would improve one's hearing. This change was comprehensive. Even though Suzimo was human, his physical body and 5 senses were stronger than spirit beasts. Even though the 2 Dao children spoke softly, Suzimo could hear them clearly. Out of more than 500 people, only 5 could join the sect at most, a ratio of 100 to 1. What did that mean? Suzimo initially thought that he could join Misty Peak easily with his heaven spirit root, but now it seemed like he could not rely on it. The conditions to join Misty Peak must be extremely stringent. Otherwise, there would not be so many people eliminated. Just as Suzimo was pondering, he heard the 2 Dao children continue chatting. "Senior brother, who do you think are the 5 people? There's a man and a woman who don't seem to fit in. Even though they're only at level 5 Qi condensation, they have an extraordinary aura. These 2 are similar. Oh, there's also a little fatty over there. He looks smart and should be good too. Junior brother, he's even fatter than you." Suzimo's gaze shifted. Outside the crowd, there was a man and a woman standing not far away from the crowd. The man was about the same age as Suzimo. He wore a purple robe and had sword-like eyebrows that reached his temples. His face was as sharp as a knife, and his expression was proud and aloof. His hands were clasped behind his back and his eyes were closed. The woman was wearing a spotless white robe. She was extremely beautiful and had a celestial appearance. However, her expression was cold. Even if one looked at her from afar, one could feel a faint chill. Suzimo had a feeling that men didn't want to be in the same group as others because they didn't want to be in the same group as others. As for the little fatty that the two Taoist children mentioned, to be more precise, this little fatty was not young at all. He looked to be about 15 or 16 years old. His neck and waist could not be seen. At first glance he looked like a big bucket with two elephant legs. He ran around in the crowd without stopping for a moment. On his round face, his small eyes blinked and darted around. In just 3 days, he had already blended in with the crowd. "Senior brother, there's a scholar with a bow and saber over there. Do you think he has a chance?" The fat Taoist child asked again. When he heard the two Taoist children talking about him, Suzimo was curious and wanted to hear what the skinny Taoist child had to say. "That person is a little strange. Even though he's a scholar, he has a bow and saber on his back. I'm starting to wonder if his bow and saber are hollow." Right then a ray of morning light shone on the green mountains and clear waters. The sun had just risen. The two Taoist children tidied their robes and stood on both sides of the stone door with solemn expressions. The skinny Taoist child raised his voice. "Misty Peak is open to accepting disciples. You have to pass 3 trials. The first trial is called the Immortal Fate Trial. The Tao of Immortality is all about fate. The fact that all of you were able to pass through the thick fog and reach this place means that you are fated with Misty Peak. The second trial is called the Spirit Testing Trial. Everyone, line up and pass through this stone door in order. Those with superior class, earthly or heaven spirit roots will be able to pass through to the third trial. The third trial is called the Life and Death Trial. Those who pass through the second trial will have to follow the stone steps behind me and ascend the mountain until you reach the peak. Let me remind all of you that this trial is extremely dangerous. If you're not careful, you'll fall into a bottomless abyss and die without a corpse. Please be careful and do not force yourself." When they heard that, everyone's heart skipped a beat as their expressions changed. Everyone entered Misty Peak to seek immortality and longevity. If they lost their lives just because they joined a sect, what was the point of cultivating immortality? The peak was shrouded in fog and one could not see the end of it. Needless to say, one could guess that this mountain path would not be easy to traverse. The dozens of Qi refinement warriors present smiled confidently. It was nothing more than climbing a mountain. All of them could soar on their swords and this trial was a piece of cake for them. In the crowd, a mortal was indignant as he shouted, "Brothers, they're Qi refinement warriors to begin with. Naturally they can fly to the peak easily. But we have to climb step by step. That's not fair." "Humph!" One of the Qi refinement warriors harumphed coldly. "There's no such thing as fairness in this world. Life is divided into different levels. If you want fairness, you should go out and condense your Qi first before coming back." That mortal was speechless and indignant. The two children of Ethereal sect were not angry. The fat child smiled and said, "Everyone, you're thinking too much. This path is fair for everyone. Even Qi refinement warriors might not be able to reach the peak. If they're not careful, they'll be buried here as well." The fat child seemed to have said something wrong as he hurriedly changed his words in a fluster. Everyone did not think too much about it, and merely thought that the fat child had said something wrong. When they heard that, many of the mortals present heaved a sigh of relief. However, the dozens of Qi refinement warriors had terrible expressions. It was not easy for them to cultivate and some of them were even at level 9 Qi refinement. If they were to die here just because they joined a sect, Suzimo glanced sideways. The arrogant man in purple robes still had his eyes closed, as though he did not take the words of the two children to heart. The white-bloused woman's face was cold and expressionless as well. Her eyes were emotionless as though they were frozen. The little fatty in the crowd was laughing and joking. He seemed to be carefree and didn't care at all. "Come on, first person." The skinny child raised his hand slightly, gesturing for the person standing at the front to walk through the stone door. That person was a Qi refinement warrior at level 7 Qi refinement warrior. When he heard that, the person was a little nervous. However, he suddenly stopped in front of the stone door and bowed to the two children, asking with a smile, "Fellow Taoists, is an ordinary spirit root not enough? Is there no leeway at all?" The two children shook their heads. Sighing gently, the person walked towards the stone door. The moment he walked through the stone door, a water screen appeared in the middle of the stone door with 4 different colors shimmering on it. For attributes and an ordinary spirit root, the person tried his best to barge through the stone door but was blocked by the four-colored water screen. Unable to move forward, he was sent flying in the blink of an eye. Failure. The fat child looked apologetic and nodded to the person. He then looked at the crowd and declared, "Next." Chapter 62. False Spirit Root Fail. Ordinary Spirit Root Fail. Superior Class Spirit Root Pass. Everyone walked towards the stone door one after another. However, most of them were blocked outside and could not pass through the stone door. Only those with superior class spirit roots and above could pass the spirit testing stage. In the blink of an eye, there were only dozens of people left. Among them were the arrogant man, the white-bloused woman, Little Fatty, and Suzimo. None of them had a heaven spirit root. There were more than 10 people with earth spirit roots and the rest were all superior class. The two Dao children could not hide their disappointment, and could not help but place their hopes on the remaining dozens of people. At that moment, Little Fatty walked towards the stone door with a grin. Just as Little Fatty arrived in front of the stone door, a loud bang came from the stone door. Everyone jumped in fright. Rumble. Boom. The water screen in the middle of the stone door turned yellow and gradually solidified like a sturdy wall made of earth. Earth element, heaven spirit root. Up till now, there was finally a heaven spirit root among the 500 people. The eyes of the two Dao children lit up and they smiled, nodding at Little Fatty in a friendly manner. Little Fatty passed through the stone door with ease and arrived beside the two Dao children with a grin. He held their hands affectionately and started chatting with them, as though they were good friends who had not seen each other in years. The two Dao children were a little stunned. They had barely exchanged a few words and they had almost told him about their ancestors. When he saw that, Suzimo chuckled internally. This Little Fatty was an easygoing person. Even though he looked honest and cute, he was more cunning than anyone else. Before long, the skinny Dao child was the first to react. He coughed gently and shook off Little Fatty's chubby hands, saying in a deep voice, "Fellow Taoist, please respect yourself and wait at the side for a moment. Don't disturb us." Yes. Respect. I know that I'm serious, Little Fatty chuckled without any hint of awkwardness. The skinny Dao child rolled his eyes and shook off Little Fatty hurriedly. He shouted towards the side of the stone door, "Next." Another person stepped forward and failed. Fewer and fewer people were left on the other side of the stone gate. The arrogant man finally opened his eyes. His gaze shifted to the white-robed woman not far away. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly as he walked towards the stone door. The arrogant man's actions immediately attracted everyone's attention. This person seemed to be born to be a king. His every move would attract the attention of everyone. Little Fatty stopped smiling and looked at the stone door. The woman in white frowned slightly and lifted her head to look at the arrogant man. However, her eyes were still cold. The arrogant man came to the front of the stone door and stood still. The water curtain in the middle of the stone door did not show any color. After a short silence, a burst of laughter came from the crowd. "You don't even have a spirit root, what are you pretending for?" "That's right. I thought it was someone incredible." "That's not right. Without spirit root, how did he become a chi refinement warrior?" As soon as he finished speaking, the entire place fell silent. Just now, the people who were laughing at the arrogant man felt as if their throats were being strangled by a pair of invisible hands. They were dumbfounded. The two Dao children had grim expressions. Little Fatty seemed to have thought of something as his rotund body shuddered, and he could not conceal the shock in his eyes. Woof! Woof! Right then, a strange sound of wind could be heard in front of the stone door. The water curtain shimmered as though it was being blown by a gentle breeze. Wind attribute. Variant spirit root. The two Dao children exclaimed. When he heard that, Suzimo's heart skipped a beat. Among the 5 types of spirit roots, the heaven spirit root was the best and rarest. However, the rarest type of spirit root was the variant spirit root, such as wind, thunder, ice, light, darkness, and so on. If the heaven spirit root was 1 in 10,000, the variant spirit root was 1 in 100,000. Of course, the variant spirit root was also a type of heaven spirit root. It did not mean that it was stronger than the heaven spirit root of the 5 elements. It was just that it was extremely rare. The arrogant man smiled and passed through the stone door with ease. The skinny Dao child whispered excitedly, "Junior brother, wait here first. I'll report to the peak master and be back soon." All right. Go on, senior brother," the fat Dao child replied hurriedly. Right then, the white-bloused woman outside the stone door moved as well. "Hold on, senior brother. It won't be too late to leave after taking a look at this one." The fat Dao child called the skinny Dao child back. The skinny Dao child nodded and stared fixedly at the white-bloused woman, as though he was even more nervous than her. When the white-bloused woman arrived before the stone door, there was still no color on the water curtain. This time round no one mocked her anymore. Could it be another variant spirit root? The two Dao children widened their eyes in disbelief. Everyone held their breaths instinctively and stared at the stone door. Crack! 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 Suddenly, the water curtain within the stone door was covered in a layer of frost and turned into ice in the blink of an eye. An ice attribute variant spirit root. Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air. It's been dozens of years since a variant spirit root has appeared in Misty Peak. Now there are two of them. No, I've got to report to the peak master. The skinny Dao child summoned a flying sword and sped towards the back of the mountain, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Everyone looked at the haughty man and the white-bloused woman with envy and respect. Little Fatty came before the white-bloused woman with a grin and said in a fawning manner, "Sister, you're so beautiful. I've never seen such a beautiful sister in my entire life. You're even prettier than our village belle, Sister Kaifeng." Everyone was instantly dumbfounded and rolled their eyes. Little Fatty really didn't know how to choose his words. Village belle, Sister Kaifeng? Little Fatty wasn't wrong. The white-bloused woman was indeed extremely beautiful. However, most people wouldn't have the cheek to say something like that, let alone in front of her. However, the strange thing was that when these words came out of Little Fatty's mouth, they sounded very natural and sincere. It didn't feel strange at all. If it was any other woman, they would definitely be embarrassed to hear such blatant praise. However, the white-bloused woman's expression did not change. She merely glared at Little Fatty coldly without saying anything. Little Fatty wasn't discouraged even though he was snubbed. He snuck to the side of the haughty man and said with admiration, "Brother, you've got such a great figure. I'm so envious." Scram! The haughty man opened his mouth and spat out a single word. "All right." Little Fatty nodded his head seriously and started rolling on the ground without a care for the filth. His body was plump to begin with and was round like a ball. Now that he was rolling on the ground, it was hard to tell if he was a ball or a person. The white-bloused woman's lips twitched and the frost in her eyes melted, revealing a faint smile. Little Fatty's eyes were extremely crafty. When he caught sight of that, he scampered to the white-bloused woman's side with a mesmerized expression. His eyes seemed to be sparkling as he praised, "Sister, you're so beautiful when you smile." The smile in the white-bloused woman's eyes disappeared instantly. Instead, she reached out with her fair palm and knocked Little Fatty on the head gently. Little Fatty smiled with a look of enjoyment. To think that there would be such a shameless person in this world. That thought flashed through everyone's minds. The fat child looked at the remaining dozens of people and found nothing out of the ordinary. He waved his hand impatiently and said, "Continue with the test. Hurry up." Suzimo tidied his clothes and walked forward. Chapter 63. Suzimo's actions did not attract anyone's attention. Compared to the haughty man, the white-bloused woman and Little Fatty, Suzimo was way too ordinary and was merely dressed weirdly. The reason why Suzimo was the last to take the test was not because he wanted to shock the world with a single feat, it was because he did not have a spirit root to begin with. Even though Dai Yu had planted a spirit root in him, he was still a little nervous, afraid that something might happen. Suzimo stood in front of the stone door and stared fixedly at the water screen before him. Swoosh! The water screen before him flashed with a red light and burst into flames in the blink of an eye, emitting a scorching heat. Suzimo was elated. Fire attribute. Heaven spirit root. Other than the haughty man and the white-bloused woman, everyone else looked over. Among the 500-odd people, other than the two variant spirit roots, Little Fatty was the only one with the earth attribute heaven spirit root. Suzimo was the second to have the heaven spirit root, and that was rather eye-catching. Furthermore, Those with some common cultivation knowledge knew that a fire spirit root was better than an earth spirit root. On the one hand, the fire attribute was the strongest amongst the 5 elements in terms of killing power. On the other hand, having the fire attribute meant that one had a chance of becoming an elixir refinement master or a weapon refinement master. That was because those 2 types of cultivators had extremely high requirements in terms of control, understanding, and cultivation of fire. Therefore, cultivators with fire spirit roots had an innate advantage. Little Fatty stood by the stone gate, eager to try and strike up a conversation with Suzimo after he passed through the stone gate so that he could get familiar with him. When the fat child who was initially bored saw this, he could not help but exclaim softly. Smiling, he nodded. Not bad, not bad. Come on over, young master. After all, the fat child was not too surprised when he saw the fire spirit root after the 2 variant spirit roots appeared consecutively. At that moment, no one noticed Suzimo's abnormality. Suzimo stood motionlessly in front of the stone door, and did not pass through immediately. It was not that he did not want to, but the stone door did not allow him to. Suzimo felt an immense resistance that wanted to keep him outside the door. Logically speaking, the water screen in the middle of the stone door would only block those with no, pseudo, and ordinary spirit roots. However, even though Suzimo clearly had a heaven spirit root, the scarlet water screen blocked him. If not for the fact that Suzimo's physique was strong, he would have been sent flying by the water screen like the first Chi refinement warrior. How could this be? As Suzimo resisted the resistance, he tried to think of a countermeasure. No one knew his background better than Suzimo. To begin with, he was without a spirit root. In that case, it was because it was blocked. But what was going on with the fire spiritual root before his eyes? If this stalemate were to continue, everyone else would notice that something was amiss, let alone the fat child of ethereal sect, and Suzimo's trip would be for naught. Not take it. Suzimo was indignant. Why? He had already come this far. How could he still be blocked by a stone door? With a dark expression, Suzimo took a step towards the water screen in front of him. With that step, Suzimo had already executed the stance of the plow heaven stride. His aura surged and he exuded a murderous aura. Even the fat child beside the stone door was shocked. The arrogant man seemed to have sensed something. He opened his eyes and looked towards the stone door. The white-bloused woman also glanced sideways and frowned slightly. The next moment, everyone discovered an extremely strange scene. Suzimo had almost passed through the stone door. However, the scarlet water screen did not dissipate. It was like a layer of elastic gauze that wrapped around his body tightly, as though it was trying its best to block him. Everyone present was dumbfounded. What was going on? Fire element, heaven spirit root. That was right. However, why would the stone door block this person? Suzimo was wrestling with the scarlet water screen in the middle of the stone door. All of a sudden, Suzimo narrowed his eyes and a series of crackling sounds could be heard from his body. His body seemed to have expanded slightly as his tendons and bones sounded at the same time. With a soft holler, he took another step forward. Splash! The water screen shattered and scattered all over the ground. After successfully passing through the stone door, Suzimo's expression relaxed. He heaved a sigh of relief and came to the side of the fat child. Suzimo was about to speak when he noticed the strange look in the fat child's eyes as he stared at something behind him. Snap! Right then a sound came from behind Suzimo. Suzimo turned back instinctively. Strangely, a crack had appeared on the beam of the stone gate that was 30 feet tall. Crack! Crack! Before anyone could react, the crack spread rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it covered the entire stone door. It was a frightening sight. Suzimo's heart skipped a beat. Rumble! Boom! Accompanied by a deafening sound, the stone door collapsed right in front of everyone, turning into a pile of rubble that sent dust flying everywhere. After the deafening sound, there was a dead silence. Everyone's expressions froze. The haughty man frowned. A look of surprise flashed through the eyes of the white-bloused woman as well. Her mouth was slightly agape and she lost her composure. Little Fatty was so shocked that his eyeballs nearly popped out. Explode, explode, explode? The fat child was completely dumbfounded. His eyes were lost and his mind was blank. It was already shocking enough that he had a mutated spirit root. Even his senior brother had run to the back to inform the peak master. What was the meaning of this green-robed scholar before him? To think that he would cause the stone door to explode just for a spirit root test. Feeling guilty, Suzimo coughed gently and revealed a friendly smile. He looked at the fat child and asked, "Fellow Taoist, this stone door must be quite old, right?" "Ah, that's right," the fat child replied instinctively. "It's been a few thousand years." "That's it." Suzimo nodded and said with a stern expression, "The stone door has been exposed to the elements for a long time and has not been maintained for a long time. It's only natural that there would be some problems. Unfortunately, I caught up with you." "Ah." The fat child's mouth was agape and his jaw almost dropped to the ground. Suzimo patted the fat child on the shoulder and said earnestly, "Actually, this isn't a bad thing. At the very least, it can remind your sect to take care of some of the old buildings in the sect regularly so that a situation like this doesn't happen again. It's better to be prepared for a rainy day." The fat child did not understand to begin with and his mind was in a mess. When he heard Suzimo's words, he was even more confused and almost believed it. In reality, this stone door was originally a gigantic spirit testing stone. The cultivators of Ethereal sect dug out the middle of the stone and placed it here, resulting in the stone door before them. The spirit testing stone was a spirit item of the universe, and was extremely sensitive towards spirit roots. There was no way it would be destroyed just because it had not been maintained for a long time. If no one had destroyed it, it wouldn't have been an issue for tens of thousands of years, let alone a few thousand years. Little Fatty's eyes darted around and he was the first to react as he secretly gave Suzimo a thumbs up. Little Fatty felt that he had yet to reach the level where Suzimo could spout nonsense with such a straight face and could not help but admire him. Suzimo lamented internally. The situation before him was truly out of his expectations. Just now, his words seemed like he was trying to fool a child. However, it was still better than having his background exposed. Chapter 64. The fat child was dazed by Suzimo's words and stood rooted to the ground for a long time. Unable to make sense of it, he pointed at Suzimo and stammered, "I'll report to the peak master as well." The fat child shook his head, as though trying to clear his head. Slapping his storage bag, he summoned his flying sword and darted towards the back of the mountain. In the blink of an eye, the two children guarding the place had run away. The fat Tao child was flustered and left in a hurry without leaving any instructions. Little Fatty seemed to be very interested in Suzimo as he scurried over with glowing eyes. Raising his head, he asked, "Bro, how did you do it? Can you teach me?" Suzimo's expression was unchanged as he shook his head. "That shouldn't have anything to do with me." Even though he said that, Suzimo was grumbling in his heart. There were only two reasons why the stone door had stopped him. Firstly, it was because he did not have a spirit root to begin with. Secondly, even though they both had heaven spirit roots, the fire spirit root that Daiyu planted in him was different from normal ones. Suzimo could not explain which reason it was. After the spirit testing stage, there were only 80 people left out of the 500, with more than 20 of them being Qi refinement warriors. According to the normal order, the remaining 80 people should have followed the path behind the stone door towards the peak of the mountain for the third stage, the life and death stage. However, the two children of Ethereal sect had already run to the back of the mountain. Everyone stood where they were without a choice, not knowing if they should continue up the mountain or wait where they were. Right then, the haughty man smiled and led the way up the mountain. The moment he moved, the others were eager to give it a try as well. The two Taoist children had said that the third stage was nothing more than following the mountain path and climbing to the peak. However, everyone had their own plans. If they could be the first to reach the peak, their chances of entering the sect would be much higher. After the haughty man, the white-bloused woman moved as well. Everyone looked at each other and followed closely behind him. The mountain path was paved with bluestone. It was neither rugged nor bumpy. The scenery along the way was pleasant. Ancient trees stood tall with luxuriant foliage, and the chirping of birds was pleasant to the ear. Looking at the surrounding scenery and traveling through the clouds, Xiao Chun felt like he was in an immortal realm. He felt relaxed and happy. It did not feel like a life and death situation at all. Suzimo was not in a hurry. He followed behind the crowd. From Suzimo's point of view, since the ethereal sect had set up this hurdle, it would definitely not be that whoever reached the peak first would have the advantage. Firstly, it was too vulgar. Secondly, it was unfair to all the mortals present. Thirdly, if it was so simple, it wouldn't be called a trial of life and death. Little Fatty was originally circling around the arrogant man and the white-robed woman. Ever since Suzimo tested his spirit roots and caused the stone door to explode, Little Fatty had been following behind Suzimo. Along the way, his little mouth had not stopped moving. Worried that his background would be exposed, Suzimo was a little distracted and would only reply occasionally. Bro, other people test their spirit roots and it's all normal. But your spirit root test is good. It's like a local god farting. Why do you say that? It's extraordinary. Bro, you have a dignified appearance and an extraordinary aura. Your background must not be simple, right? I studied for a few years in the past. Aya bro, you're practically farting in your bed. You're both literate, smelling, and martial covering. Suzimo finally understood Little Fatty's capabilities. He hurriedly took a few steps forward, wanting to squeeze into the crowd. Right then, the crowd at the front suddenly stopped in their tracks. Suzimo raised his head and frowned. The mountain path had come to an end. In front of everyone stood a steep cliff that pierced through the clouds. The top was shrouded in clouds and they could not see the end of it. The true test was here. Just now, the flat mountain path was just a cushion. The many mortals present looked at the mountain peak with grim expressions. To them, the only way to reach the peak was to climb with their bare hands. However, the mountain peak was way too steep and there was almost no space to stand on. On both sides of the mountain path was a bottomless abyss. If they lost their footing, they would definitely fall to their deaths. Everyone could not help but recall what the two Dao children said previously. This stage was extremely dangerous. If they were not careful, they would fall into the bottomless abyss and die without a corpse. They had to be careful and not force it. Many mortals revealed timid expressions as they began to think of retreating. Some of them were indignant and discussed softly. This ethereal sect is too much. It's just joining a sect. There's no need for us to risk our lives. That's right. Our spirit roots are not bad either. If we really can't do it, we can just join other sections. It's better than falling to our deaths. I wonder how high this mountain peak is. What if we run out of stamina halfway? Unlike most mortals, the 20-odd chi refinement warriors present looked relaxed. To mortals, this mountain peak was unreachable. However, to them, it was nothing more than riding on their flying swords and rising into the air. One of the chi refinement warriors withdrew a flying sword from his storage bag and leaped up. Waving his robes, he looked suave as he chuckled. I'll make a move first. I'll wait for everyone at the peak. With that, he soared into the air and disappeared into the clouds in the blink of an eye. The other chi refinement warriors did not want to be left behind as they summoned their spirit weapons and flew towards the peak. The strange thing was that the arrogant man did not move. Instead, he frowned slightly and looked into the depths of the clouds. No one knew what he was thinking about. It was the same for the white-bloused woman as she stood on the spot, deep in thought. A few mortals mustered their courage and began to climb towards the peak as well. Compared to the chi refinement warriors, these mortals were much slower and every step was treacherous. If they missed a step, they would fall into the bottomless abyss. Bro, aren't you moving? Little Fatty looked at Suzimo and asked. Suzimo was about to speak when he heard a tragic cry from the clouds. Ah! Everyone's heart skipped a beat. In the blink of an eye, a figure fell from the clouds above. It streaked across everyone's eyes and fell into the dark abyss beside them. At the sight of that, everyone's expressions changed drastically. They felt chills down their spines and goosebumps all over their bodies. The person who fell into the abyss was the chi refinement warrior who had set off first. The chi refinement warrior was dead? What had that person encountered above? The clouds above were tumbling and changing unpredictably, emitting a chilling killing intent. Ah! There was another tragic cry. A figure streaked across and disappeared into the abyss on both sides of the mountain path. Gulp gulp. The sound of saliva being swallowed could be heard from the crowd. Within this short period of time, 2 chi refinement warriors had already died in the bottomless abyss. The 2 Dao children were right. The third round was fair to everyone. Even Qi refinement warriors might not be able to reach the peak. Some of the mortals who had just set off and did not climb too high were hanging on the mountain walls. At the sight of that, their faces turned pale and they were drenched in sweat. Someone had already started to climb down the mountain walls. What a joke! Even the Qi refinement warriors were dead. There was no need for them to take this risk. Suddenly, the arrogant man smiled and muttered to himself, "Life and death round, life and death round. Life at the peak of the mountain and death at the foot of the mountain. It's either life or death. Interesting. There's a challenge." Chapter 65. Many people looked at the haughty man with a different expression. Everyone was so scared that their faces were drained of color, and they had thoughts of retreating. Only the haughty man was not afraid. Instead, there was a look of eagerness in his eyes. There was another series of tragic cries. The Qi refinement warriors who were the first to move fell from the clouds one after another. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared into the bottomless abyss on both sides of the mountain path. At the sight of this, someone finally could not take it anymore and started to turn back. Little Fatty was secretly shocked and exclaimed, "Just now, a level 9 Qi refinement warrior has fallen. What exactly did they encounter above the clouds?" Suzimo looked even more closely. Just now, a total of 23 Qi refinement warriors had soared into the sky. In just a short while, all of them had fallen and none of them were spared. This was a little terrifying. The many mortals who retreated from the mountain wall were so scared that their faces turned pale. Their hearts were still pounding and their limbs were trembling. They went down the mountain without even turning back. There was a total of more than 80 people who passed the second stage. Now that 23 Qi refinement warriors had failed and more than half of the mortals had retreated, there were only 17 people left standing at the foot of the mountain. These 17 people were all strong-willed people. Even when they saw many Qi refinement warriors falling one after another, there was no fear in their eyes. Little Fatty had been making jokes and laughing along the way. However, at this moment, he was quiet and his little eyes were darting around. No one knew what he was thinking about. Suzimo had a feeling that this life and death stage was a little unusual. There was a hint of strangeness in every aspect. However, Suzimo could not pinpoint exactly what was wrong. Almost at the same time, the haughty man and the white-bloused lady took out their flying swords and soared into the sky. However, their speed was obviously reduced. It was clear that the two of them were extremely cautious and did not dare to be careless. "Brother, be careful. I'll go up and scout for you first." Little Fatty was also a Qi refinement warrior. He took out a small shield from the storage bag at his waist. It opened in the wind and expanded rapidly, lifting his fat body up slowly. The remaining 14 people, including Suzimo, were all mortals without spirit Qi. If one wanted to reach the top of the mountain, they could only use their hands and feet to climb bit by bit. Suzimo no longer hesitated. He arrived at the foot of the mountain wall and leaped up. He was light and agile as he directly hung on the mountain wall. Then he climbed up quickly. The remaining 13 mortals were dumbfounded. They almost thought that it wasn't a human that had gone up, but a monkey. Now that Suzimo's tendons transformation chapter was nearing completion, he was as agile as a python, as nimble as an ape, as swift as the wind, and as swift as an arrow. To him, the mountain peak before him was not an obstacle at all. Apes were born with the spirit of climbing mountains and the skill of climbing rocks. If Suzimo gave it his all, even if a Qi refinement warrior rode on a flying sword and soared into the sky, his speed might not be faster than him. Back then at the Tsonglang mountain range, Elder Qian of the Joyful clan leaped into the air while Suzimo climbed up the towering ancient tree. Both of their speeds were almost the same. Of course, at that time, Suzimo had used the Sanguine Ape transformation, while Elder Qian was a foundation establishment cultivator. Even though Suzimo did not use his full strength, it did not take long for him to leave the remaining 13 mortals far behind him. Caw-caw. Right then, Suzimo's ears twitched and he could vaguely hear a series of bird cries. After living in the Tsonglang mountain range for a year, although Suzimo was still unable to understand the language of birds and beasts, he could more or less understand the emotions in their cries. The series of bird cries clearly had a hint of excitement and mockery. Why is there a spirit beast? Suzimo frowned slightly. However, He did not reduce his speed and continued to climb upwards. "Bastard, how dare you!" Not long after, the arrogant man's angry rebuke sounded from above. Suzimo raised his head and looked up with narrowed eyes. In the depths of the clouds, a gigantic bird spread its wings and cried into the air. Its body was faintly discernible as it attacked the arrogant man, the white-bloused woman and little fatty continuously in midair. A gentle flap of the bird's wings would cause a strong gust of wind. Little fatty and the other two swayed in midair, as though they could fall at any moment. A spirit demon? Suzimo's heart skipped a beat. The bird gave off an aura that was no different from a spirit demon. It seemed to have just entered the spirit demon realm not long ago, and was equivalent to an early-stage Foundation establishment cultivator. Even so, the strength of the bird was enough to crush little fatty and the other two. It was clear that the bird was not using its full strength. Like a cat chasing a mouse, it circled above the three of them and flapped its wings occasionally. Little fatty and the other two could not continue ascending. The arrogant man had a wind spirit root to begin with. Although he was swaying in the strong winds, he could still maintain his balance. The white-bloused woman had a cold expression and a crystalline ice barrier appeared around her. It was clear that she had already used a talisman. Little fatty relied on the wide and stable shield and sprawled on it. He gripped the edge of the shield tightly with both hands and his chubby face was covered in sweat with a frantic gaze. So, this is the obstacle of the life and death juncture. We can only reach the peak by passing through the obstruction of this bird. Suzimo pondered for a moment and understood the reason behind it. Just as he was about to continue climbing, little fatty's exclamation sounded from above. Perhaps because the bird saw that Suzimo and the others had climbed up as well, it did not want to continue fighting with little fatty and the other two. It flapped its wings furiously and a strong gust of wind howled. Little fatty was the first to give in and fell from midair. Even his shield was blown away and nowhere to be found. Ah! Little fatty was so scared that his face turned pale. He bared his fangs and brandished his claws as he screamed. When he saw Suzimo from above, he quickly said, "Big brother, run. There's a big bird up there and it's very fierce." The direction in which little fatty fell was not far from Suzimo. Suzimo had a good impression of little fatty and could not leave him in the lurch. Hence, he moved his body and kept moving horizontally along the mountain wall. He pulled little fatty from midair. Little fatty rolled his eyes and drooled. He seemed to have fainted from fright and was unconscious. Suzimo frowned. He was already halfway up the mountain. If he wanted to put little fatty down, it would take some effort. Even though little fatty was heavy, he was nothing compared to the cold moon saber on Suzimo's waist and the sanguine crystal bow on his back. At that thought, Suzimo dragged little fatty with one hand and continued climbing with both feet and one hand. His speed did not decrease at all. Suzimo could finally see it clearly when he got closer. It was an immortal crane that did not look old and was still in its infancy. However, its eyes were filled with excitement. It was as if shooting down the climbers was the most fun and interesting game for it. The immortal crane swooped down and extended its claws, landing on the white-bloused woman's talisman ice shield. Crack, crack. The ice shield shattered and was easily torn apart by the immortal crane's claws. A gust of wind blew and the white-bloused woman fell from the flying sword. Although her eyes were dim, she did not make a sound and fell into the abyss in the blink of an eye. The haughty man followed closely behind. Under the attack of the immortal crane, he could not last more than 3 breaths and fell from midair with an indignant look on his face. Caw caw. The immortal crane raised its head and cried, looking pleased. Chapter 66. Suzimo no longer had any doubts when he saw how the haughty man and white-bloused woman had fallen into the bottomless abyss. There was no way anyone who fell into the abyss would die. The fact that the two of them possessed mutated spirit roots had already alerted the Peak Master of Misty Peak. How could they die so easily? However, Suzimo did not know what would happen to those who fell into the abyss. Suzimo shifted horizontally, avoiding the crane's line of sight as he sped towards the peak. Even though he only had one hand, Suzimo's toes were as nimble as his fingers after removing his shoes. Digging into the walls of the mountain, he climbed upwards rapidly. The crane was extremely sensitive as it circled in midair, and arrived above Suzimo's head. It cried out twice with a mocking look in its eyes, as though it was mocking Su Zimo's cleverness. The man and crane finally met. On the other side, there were two middle-aged Taoist priests sitting opposite each other on the summit of a mountain. Both of them were dressed in white robes. However, one of them had a flying sword embroidered on his cuff, while the other had a hexagonal symbol embroidered on his cuff. Both of them sipped their tea leisurely. Beside the two middle-aged priests stood a skinny child who seemed to be saying something with an agitated expression. Mutated spirit roots? And there are two of them? One of the middle-aged Taoist priest's expression changed slightly as he put down his teacup and asked. The skinny child nodded hurriedly. The other middle-aged Taoist priest asked, "What are their spirit roots?" The skinny child replied, "One of them is a wind spirit root while the other is an ice spirit root." When they heard that, the two middle-aged Taoist priests exchanged glances and smiled, seemingly satisfied. Wuxia, Spirit Peak is going to have two more geniuses. Misty Peak had 6 peaks. The tallest one in the middle was the true Misty Peak that could be seen from the outside. Misty Peak was surrounded by 5 other peaks: Spirit Peak, Elixir Peak, Talisman Peak, Array Peak and Weapon Peak. The Taoist priest called Wuxia was the one with the flying sword embroidered on his sleeve. He was the Peak Master of Spirit Peak. The other was Xianyi, the Peak Master of Array Peak. Anyone who could become the Peak Masters of the 5 peaks was definitely a perfected Jin Dan. Even though the 5 peaks had their own strengths, Spirit Peak was the leader with the most disciples. Spirit Peak valued cultivation realm and everything they taught was about killing techniques of cultivators. If a mutated or heaven spirit root were to appear, they would be chosen by Spirit Peak. Standing, Wuxia smiled. "I'll go take a look. Let's see how many trims those two fellas will survive." Don't worry. People with mutated spiritual roots are blessed with luck. They will definitely be able to survive the 2 tribulations. A mocking look flashed through the eyes of Array Peak's master, Xianyi, as he teased, "Look at how anxious you are. Even as a Peak Master, you can't hold it in anymore. Let's go take a look." Wuxia laughed loudly and pulled Xianyi's wrist, wanting to leave together. Xianyi shook his head and quickly retreated. He smiled. "I'm not going. Seeing such a good seedling being taken in by Spirit Peak, I'm just asking for trouble." Right then, a chubby child arrived on his flying sword, panting heavily. "Peak Master. No. This is bad." The 2 Peak Masters glanced at each other in surprise. "Junior brother, why are you here as well?" The skinny child walked up and asked. The chubby child was sweating profusely as he waved his chubby hands. "Peak Master, the spirit testing gate exploded." Exploded? Wuxia and Xianyi exchanged glances in confusion. Wuxia asked, "Why did the spirit testing gate explode? Did someone destroy it?" "No." The chubby child shook his head before nodding. "Yes. No. The 2 Peak Masters were confused by the chubby child. "What's going on? Speak properly." Wuxia pulled a long face and hollered. In the mind of the fat Dao child, he could not help but recall the words of the green-robed scholar. Subconsciously, he imitated the words and said with a serious face, "Perhaps the spirit testing gate has been exposed to the elements for a long time and has not been maintained for a long time, causing it to break down." Bam! Wuxia extended his finger and flicked the chubby child on the head. "Ow!" The chubby child clutched his head and pouted his lips, looking aggrieved. What a load of nonsense! Xianyi could not help but chuckle. "Who taught you that? You can't say it yourself, can you?" "There was a scholar who said so." The chubby child continued, "However, I feel that he made sense. He even kindly told me to take note of the sect in the future to take care of some of the ancient buildings lest bam. It was another flick. A huge red bump appeared on the chubby child's head. The chubby child was about to cry from the slap as he asked with watery eyes, "Peak Master, why are you always hitting me? Child, you're way too dumb. Even if you're sold off in the future, you'll still have to count the money for them." Xianyi did not know to laugh or to cry. Wuxia said in a deep voice, "Tell me the entire story. Don't hide anything." There was a scholar with a bow and saber. He came to the spirit testing gate and it showed that he had a fire spirit root, the chubby child said. "Continue." However, the spirit testing gate refused to let him in and the scholar barged in. Thereafter, the spirit testing gate exploded. When Xian and Xianyi frowned and exchanged glances, they still did not understand. When Xian pressed on, "Are you sure it's a fire spirit root?" "That's right." The chubby child explained hurriedly, "Peak Master, you've got to believe me. Even though I'm a little dumb, I can tell that it's a fire spirit root." "That's strange," Xianyi was perplexed. After pondering for a moment, Xianyi said, "When Xian, I'll go with you to check out the background of that scholar." Without using any spirit weapons, the two of them soared into the air and sped towards the front of the mountain with the chubby and skinny children. Before long, the four of them arrived at the location of the spirit testing gate. It's indeed shattered. Xianyi looked at the broken spirit testing gate beneath his feet and murmured softly. When Xian asked, "Where is that scholar?" He's gone." The chubby child looked around. Suddenly Xianyi said, "That's not right. They've already ascended the mountain and the 8 distresses formation in the abyss has already been activated. Yes, the two fellas with the variant spirit roots are inside as well." When Xian asked hurriedly, "How is it? How many tribulations have those two survived?" "Life and death tribulations. You can rest assured now," Xianyi smiled. Pausing for a moment, Xianyi shook his head. "There's no bow-wielding scholar in the 8 distresses formation. He must have left long ago because he was afraid." When Xian harrumphed softly, "I don't know where this lad came from. He destroyed our ethereal sex spirit testing gate and left just like that. How insolent." "Caw-caw." Right then, 2 hurried cries of cranes sounded from the clouds far away. When Xian and Xianyi turned towards the sound, on a mountain peak far away, a figure was agile and light, twisting and turning on the precipitous cliff without falling. While avoiding the attacks of the cranes, he still had the strength to climb towards the peak. There was still some distance to the peak, and even with perfected being Jin Dan's vision, he could not see clearly in the clouds. "Xianyi, look. There's a monkey over there." When Xian pointed to the black figure on the mountain peak. Chapter 67. When he heard that, Xianyi chuckled. "Fufu, our Misty Peak is one of the 5 major sects of the Great Zhou dynasty after all. It's a rare paradise as well. That monkey sure is smart to know to head up the mountain to learn from a master." "Yes, that monkey's movement technique is not bad. I wonder how long he can last against Little Crane's attacks. Judging from Little Crane's cries, she's a little angry, huh? That monkey is in for it. Let's go and take a look." When Xian and Xianyi smiled with relaxed expressions, each of them carried a child and soared into the air, speeding towards the peak in the distance. They were getting closer. After breaking through the thick fog, the smiles on Wen Xian and Xianyi's faces gradually disappeared. Their gazes were strange, as though they had witnessed something unbelievable. After a momentary silence, "Cough, that black shadow doesn't seem like a monkey?" Xianyi pointed at the black shadow that was still climbing the peak and coughed with a hesitant tone. "Yes, it seems like a person." When Xian chuckled dryly with an awkward expression. As peak masters, both of them could not help but feel embarrassed for committing such a low-level mistake. In reality, they could not be blamed for that. From afar, the black shadow on the peak was blurry, darting left and right as though it was even more agile than a monkey. Even though both of them were perfected Jin Dan and were knowledgeable, they had not expected that black shadow to be a person. When they got closer, their expressions changed once more. "That doesn't seem like a person. Yes, there should be 2 of them." After another momentary silence, when Xian's expression darkened and he could not help but grumble, "Is there something wrong with that person? It's fine if he's climbing the mountain, but what's with that little fatty? That's not right. That person is carrying a bow and saber. I seem to have heard of that before," suddenly Xianyi remarked. Right then, the fat child beside Wen Xian shouted excitedly as he pointed at the figure scurrying up and down the cliff. "Peak Master, that's him. That scholar." On the steep peak, each time the crane flapped its wings, Su Zimo would stick tightly to the stone wall and dig his fingers and feet deep into the rock. Under Su Zimo's fingers, the tough rock was as soft as tofu. If other mortals wanted to climb the peak, they would have to find a place to rest. But Su Zimo did not have to do that. If not for the crane's obstruction, Su Zimo would have been able to climb on the peak as though it was flat ground. Right now, many of the mortals behind Suzimo had already been blown away by the wind created by the wings of the immortal crane, leaving Suzimo the only one still climbing the mountain. To be precise, there were two of them. Suzimo was even holding onto a little fatty. The crane's eyes shone with a hint of anger as it cried out and soared into the skies. Swooping down, it extended its sharp claws and swiped at Suzimo. Swoosh! Suzimo wanted to dodge, but it was too late. In a flash, Suzimo suddenly let go of his grip and fell half a foot. He then reached out and dug his palms into the stone wall. Snap! Above Suzimo's head, a large piece of rock was crushed by the crane's claws. Gravel flew everywhere and landed on Suzimo's face, but he did not notice it at all. Some of the gravel landed on Little Fatty's body, causing him to shudder visibly. Suzimo's heart skipped a beat. Suddenly, he hoisted Little Fatty in the air and hollered, "Don't play dead or I'll throw you down." Little Fatty shuddered and opened his eyes, saying hurriedly, "Bro, don't scare me. I was wrong." "Do you still want to climb the mountain?" Suzimo asked hurriedly. "Yes, of course. Lie on my back. Hold on tight. Don't blame me if you fall." All right. Little Fatty moved a little and wrapped his arms and legs around Suzimo's neck and waist like an octopus. That way, even though Suzimo was still carrying someone, he had an empty hand. The crane's initial attack was not fierce, and its intention did not seem to be to hurt anyone. Instead, it was to stop Suzimo from climbing the mountain. After its repeated futile attacks, the crane was enraged. Just now, if Suzimo could not dodge in time, his head might be crushed by the crane's claws. Against an enraged early-stage Foundation establishment spirit demon, Suzimo did not dare to be careless. That was why he had Little Fatty lie on his back so that he could use both hands to deal with the crane. To be fair, Suzimo, who had only cultivated to the third section of the Mystic Classic of the 12 Demon Kings of the Great Wilderness, was not a match for a spirit demon, even if the crane was only at early-stage Foundation establishment. However, Suzimo did not want to fight the crane. Instead, he wanted to avoid the crane's interception and ascend the mountain. That way it would be much easier. Swoosh! The crane swooped down once more. Suzimo's eyes lit up and he exerted strength in his legs, shifting horizontally on the steep and slippery mountain walls. Dodging the crane's attacks, he exerted strength in his entire body and dashed upwards. Crack! 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 Suzimo's fingers and toes dug into the rocks as he climbed the mountain at a speed comparable to running on the ground. Caw-caw! When the crane saw that, it was enraged and soared into the air at an extremely fast speed. Like a sharp arrow, it arrived behind Suzimo and attacked repeatedly with its sharp claws and beak. Its long and thin beak was even sharper than a flying sword. With every stab, Suzimo would hear the sound of the wind, causing him to shudder in fear. As long as he was struck by the sharp beak, there would be a bloody hole in his body. Little Fatty was so scared that he shut his eyes tightly and shivered. Suzimo dodged repeatedly. His tendons and bones sounded at the same time, stretching and shrinking his body. His flesh was filled and his tendons were trembling continuously. He was almost at his limits. With his spirit perception, Suzimo avoided the crane's attacks by the skin of his teeth and continued climbing. The crane's cries turned more hurried and even carried a hint of killing intent. The peak was getting closer. The crane's attacks were getting more ferocious as well. At the peak of the mountain, two young Dao children watched everything as though they were in the situation. They looked nervous and could not help but break out in cold sweat for the green-robed scholar. A man and a crane were wrestling on the steep mountain peak. Even though one of them looked like he could not retaliate, it was extremely intense and dangerous. If the green-robed scholar was slightly slower, he could have died under the crane's sharp claws. When Xian and Xianyi had grim expressions as well, they watched everything intently and were prepared to save him at any moment. To think that the scholar would still have some strength left. Even after emptying his hands, he can still climb towards the peak despite little crane's attacks. Xianyi's tone was emotional. When Xian said in a deep voice, "If I'm not wrong, the saber on the scholar's waist and the bow on his back are both made from spiritual items of the universe. Even though they are pseudo-spirit weapons, the total weight of these two pseudo-spirit weapons is almost 1,000 kilograms. The meaning behind Wen Xian's words was clear. If Suzimo had removed his cold moon saber and sanguine crystal bow, he would have been able to reach the peak with more agility and speed. When Xian and Xianyi exchanged glances, both of them had a tacit understanding and the same thought flashed through their minds at the same time. This scholar is interesting. Chapter 68. How did that lad cultivate his physique? With such flexibility, coordination, and extensibility, even spirit beasts are far inferior to them. His movement technique is similar to an ape and python, but there are many differences. He must have learned it from observing wild beasts. Seems like he's rather perceptive. I wonder how many tribulations of the 8 distresses formation he can survive. At that point, when Xian and Xianyi suddenly paused and their expressions changed. When Xian murmured softly, "The 8 distresses formation is set in the abyss at the foot of the mountain. If that lad truly ascends to the peak, wouldn't he have avoided the 8 distresses formation's trial?" On the surface, Ethereal Sect's 3rd life and death trial was for cultivators to ascend the mountain. However, in reality, it was to set up obstacles at the waist of the mountain and send everyone to the bottom of the mountain to enter the 8 distresses formation. That was the reason why the fat child almost spilled the beans. That was because no one would be able to ascend the peak. Only those who survived the life and death tribulations of the 8 distresses formation would be sent to the peak and officially join the sect. If they could not survive the life and death tribulations, they would be sent outside and would not be able to join Ethereal Sect. Those cultivators did not know what was going on and merely thought that they were lucky to have escaped with their lives. The 8 distresses formation was a type of illusion formation and had a total of 8 tribulations: life tribulation, old tribulation, illness tribulation, death tribulation, hatred meeting tribulation, parting love tribulation, unattainable desire tribulation, and 5 skandhas tribulation. There were 2 reasons why they went through so much trouble to get everyone to ascend the mountain before being sent down. Firstly, the mountain peak was steep and those who were timid and had weak wills would leave on their own. Seeking the Tao was a heaven-defying act and was extremely difficult. Even with great determination and fearlessness, one might not be able to reach the end, let alone those who were afraid. Secondly, if they were to enter the 8 distresses formation directly, everyone would be prepared and it would be difficult for them to be confused by the illusions of the 8 distresses formation and the true effects would not be achieved. In the cultivation world, be it illusions or formations, there were obvious flaws. As long as one's mind was clear and their minds were firm, it would be difficult for them to be confused. However, they were sent down suddenly after they were sent up the mountain. Everyone was unprepared and fall into the abyss of the 8 distresses formation as their minds crumbled the moment of death arrive. At this moment, everyone thought that they were already dead. Naturally, they entered the illusory realm and experienced the calamity of death. After surviving the death tribulation and the life tribulation, it would be equivalent to passing the 3rd test of the Ethereal Sect and one would be able to officially join the sect. Of course, the 8 distresses formation had a total of 8 tribulations. The more tribulations one could survive, the better. This was not only a test but also a baptism of the soul. This was because everyone had to experience the pain of the 8 distresses in their life. Even cultivators couldn't avoid it. Now there was a problem. If Su Zimo ascended the mountain peak, the Ethereal Sect's 3rd stage would become a mere decoration. When Xian pondered for a moment before saying, "I'll make a move secretly and knock him down. We can't break the rules of the sect and take him in without passing through the 3rd stage." Xianyi shook his head and smiled. "Don't worry about it. I'm just curious if he can reach the top of the mountain with his own strength." Pausing for a moment, Xianyi's eyes shone brightly as he said in a deep voice, "If that lad truly ascends, I'll set up the formation for him personally and let him have a taste of the 8 distresses formation." As the peak master of Array Peak, the 8 distresses formation in the abyss was his masterpiece. Now that a peak master had declared that he was going to set up the formation for an unknown scholar, this was an unprecedented treatment in the history of Ethereal Sect. On the stone wall, a man and a crane were still circling around. Su Zimo was already drenched in sweat. However, his eyes were still bright and filled with endless fighting spirit. Initially, little Fatty's eyes were still tightly shut and his face was pale from fright. But now, he was filled with excitement as he sprawled on Su Zimo's back, roaring from time to provoke the crane. Caw-caw. Even after using everything it had, The crane could not stop Suzimo's footsteps. Now that it was mocked by little fatty, it was even more enraged and its attacks turned fiercer. After being chased by the crane the entire way, Suzimo was already filled with anger. Seeing that the peak was just a step away from his head, Suzimo took a deep breath of air and channeled the Anaconda Eclipse mental cultivation technique. He could not help but holler, "Lousy bird, take my saber." Clang! The sound of a sharp blade being unsheathed reverberated through the world. Suzimo whipped out the cold moon saber on his waist and slashed upwards. Swash! A cold light flashed past. Alarmed, the crane could no longer be bothered to attack Suzimo as it flapped its wings and fled. The crane had not expected Suzimo to strike at all. More than that, it had not expected Suzimo to strike at it. An ethereal sect, no one dared to bully it. Even the patriarch of ethereal sect would dote on it, let alone the 5 peak masters. Initially, the task of knocking down those who came to join the sect into the 8 distresses formation was done by other cultivators of the sect. The crane felt that it was interesting and volunteered to do it. Initially it was rather fun. It was excited to see people being chased into the 8 distresses formation one after another. But later on, it was no longer fun to meet this scholar with a bow and saber. A feather floated down slowly. Although the crane dodged in time, a feather was still sliced off by the cold moon saber. That scene had the 2 peak masters on the peak shuddering. They gripped their spirit weapons tightly and almost threw them out. That lad sure is gutsy. He even dares to bully little crane. If he joins the sect in the future, he's definitely going to suffer. When Xian and Xianyi looked at Suzimo with a hint of pity. At that moment Suzimo did not know about it. After that slash, Suzimo was in a great mood and laughed. "Stupid little bird, you're still too inexperienced. Go back and cultivate for a few more years." Suzimo threw the cold moon saber in reverse and stabbed it into the mountain wall. Leaping, he tapped his toes on the saber and continued ascending, using his toes to pull out the cold moon saber at the same time. The entire process was as smooth as flowing water without any sluggishness. In the blink of an eye, Suzimo was already at the peak. Suzimo turned back to look at the crane that was still circling in midair, and waved gently with a smile. Goodbye. The crane was still in its infancy. According to the age of the human race, it was only 7 or 8 years old and was at the age where it was playful and active. Now that it was slashed by Suzimo, it felt aggrieved even though it was not injured. When it saw Suzimo in such a state, the crane blinked its eyes and sobbed as it flew towards Misty Peak in a huff, crying endlessly. Caw-caw! Caw-caw! The cries of the crane reverberated through Misty Peak, alarming many people. Didn't little crane go to the front of the mountain to bully someone? Why does it seem like it's being bullied? In a palace on Elixir Peak, a young man with white hair and a youthful face was surprised. A cold woman walked out of the palace on Talisman Peak. Looking at the crane that was flying through the skies, she frowned slightly and muttered to herself, "What's wrong with little crane? Is there someone in ethereal sect who dares to bully it?" On Weapon Peak, an old man with disheveled hair and slovenly appearance popped out of nowhere and burst into laughter. It's rare to see little crane suffer. Interesting. Chapter 69. Suzimo turned around and saw 4 people. He had seen the 2 Taoist children, one fat and one skinny. The other 2 middle-aged Taoist priests looked unfamiliar but had an extraordinary bearing. They looked at Suzimo with a strange gaze. Suzimo could vaguely guess that the 2 middle-aged Taoist priests might be seniors from Misty Peak. Suzimo put down little fatty and looked around. He saw 8 huge flags around the 2 of them. Each flag was half the height of a person. The triangular flags had mysterious patterns drawn on them that fluttered in the wind. What are these? Suzimo frowned and did not think too much about it. He adjusted his breathing and tidied his clothes before cupping his fists at the 2 middle-aged Taoist priests. "Greetings, seniors. I'm Suzimo from Yin Country. I was lucky enough to reach the peak. Activate." Before Suzimo could finish his sentence, he was interrupted by a voice. The 8 flags around Suzimo and little fatty shone brightly. The patterns on the flags shone with a dazzling brilliance. In a trance, Suzimo felt a sense of danger. He saw a middle-aged Taoist priest not far away suddenly wave his sleeves. An irresistible force came crashing down. The force was so vast that Suzimo could not resist it at all. Suzimo fell from the edge of the cliff and watched helplessly as the peak of the mountain got further and further away. His body was out of his control and he could not move at all. Fear rose in his heart. Boom! Suzimo fell into the abyss and was smashed to pieces. Although his physical body was destroyed, Suzimo's consciousness was still clear. Endless pain assaulted him. The pain of his muscles and bones breaking and his flesh exploding constantly stimulated Suzimo. Why? Suzimo did not understand. He did not have the mood to think about it. The pain that was everywhere was tormenting him. Suzimo had never experienced the pain of impending death. There was great terror between life and death. This kind of terror was enough to make one collapse. Everyone was afraid of death. It was almost instinctive. Being pointed at by a knife would make one pale in fright. How terrifying would it be when death really came? On top of the mountain, Suzimo and Little Fatty were motionless. Their eyes were closed and their bodies were trembling. They did not fall into the abyss. The 8 distresses formation was activated, and the two of them were already completely immersed in the illusion. The formation that you personally set up is much more powerful than the 8 distresses formation in the abyss. Can these two little fellows withstand it? A trace of worry flashed across Wen Xian's eyes. Xianyi said, "Let's wait and see. As long as these two can survive this tribulation, they will pass the test." At this moment, 3 figures appeared on the mountaintop. These 3 people had all passed the test of the 8 distresses grand formation in the abyss and passed the 2 tribulations of life and death. They were automatically teleported to the mountaintop. The 3 of them were pale and sweating profusely. They sat on the ground powerlessly with blank expressions. The 2 Dao children hurriedly went forward and fed the 3 of them a pill. After the 3 of them swallowed the pills, their complexions relaxed slightly, and their faces gradually regained some color. The 2 little fellows with variant spirit roots are not bad. They've already passed 3 tribulations, Xianyi suddenly said. When Xian sighed. Of the 8 distresses, the 4 tribulations of life, old age, sickness and death are considered easy. However, the remaining 4 tribulations are each more difficult than the last. Even if we form our cores, we might not be able to see through them, let alone them. The moment he said that, a gigantic flag waved gently and a blinding beam of light shot into the skies. Xianyi heaved a sigh of relief and nodded. Not bad. This lad has already passed the death tribulation. A moment later, the haughty man and white-bloused woman were teleported to the peak of the mountain. When Xian looked at the 2 of them and smiled. Very good. You've passed 4 tribulations. Take a rest at the side. Swoosh! Another gigantic flag waved and a beam of light shot through the skies. They've passed through the pain of life so quickly? Xianyi was shocked. Everyone had to go through the pain of life. However, they had all forgotten about it. In the womb, the fetus was curled into a ball. Its limbs could not be stretched and it could not breathe. It was equivalent to being in a small and sealed prison and was extremely painful. That was also the reason why babies would cry the moment they were born. Not long after, another beam of light tore through the clouds. Immediately after, a 4th beam of light shone. When Xian and Xianyi exchanged glances and could see the shock in each other's eyes. From Elixir Peak, a young man with white hair and a youthful face soared into the air. Looking at the beam of light in the distance, he frowned and asked in confusion, "That beam of light is the 8 distresses formation flag. Someone is asking Xianyi to set up the formation personally?" After a slight pause, the young man muttered to himself, "No, I've got to check it out." At the same time, figures flew out of Talisman and Weapon Peak respectively and sped towards the front of the mountain. Boom! A 5th beam of light appeared. Before long, a white-haired youth, a cold woman and an old man appeared on the peak of the mountain. All 5 peak masters were gathered. Swoosh! The flag waved. A 6th beam of light shone. He's already passed 6 of the 8 distresses. Such a temperament is extremely rare. What's the background of this lad? The white-haired youth asked with a grim expression. He's from Yin country. I don't know anything else. When Xian shook his head. The cold woman swept her gaze across Suzimo and frowned slightly. Fire spirit root? That seems like it. However, the spirit testing gate didn't allow him to pass. I don't know why, but I'll test him with the spirit testing stone later on, when Xian replied. The moment he said that, boom! A seventh beam of light shone. Su Zimo had passed his seventh tribulation. Little Fatty had just passed the life and death tribulations and was so scared that he sprawled on the ground and bawled, still unable to extricate himself from the pain of the 8 distresses. In that short period of time, the 2 Dao children had already explained the entire process of the life and death tribulations to everyone. Initially, there were more than 500 people. But now, only 6 of them were left on the peak of the mountain. Apart from the haughty man, the white-bloused woman and Little Fatty, there were 3 mortals without spirit chi left. Everyone's gazes landed on Su Zimo with complicated expressions. They'd all just endured the tribulation of the 8 distresses, so they were naturally able to experience that sort of heart-burning and bone-piercing pain. None of them could imagine how torturous it was to go through all 7 types of pain. Xian Yi said in a deep voice, "The 5th distresses of the 8th distresses are actually the stacking of the previous 7 distresses. It's not something that humans can endure. I'll dispel the formation so that the child doesn't get hurt." The moment he moved, the 8th beam of light shone. The 8 beams of light were incomparably resplendent above the mountain peak, illuminating half the skies. At the same time, Su Zimo opened his eyes with killing intent. Gripping his cold moon saber in reverse, he slashed forward. It was a peerless slash. In fact, the saber beam even overshadowed the 8 beams of light above the mountain peak. That slash was directed at Xian Yi with a chilling intent, causing the air above the mountain peak to plunge to freezing point. The 5 peak masters were shocked. That slash was way too sudden. His expression was unchanged as he extended his finger. Spirit light shone brightly on his fingertip as he tapped the cold moon saber gently. Clang! The cold moon saber was sent flying. Su Zimo shuddered and stumbled back a couple of steps. His feet slipped and he nearly fell from the mountain peak. Looking down at the abyss shrouded in clouds, Su Zimo gradually came to his senses and realized that just now, everything he was experiencing was just an illusion. The way the 5 peak masters looked at Su Zimo changed gradually. Chapter 70. What truly shocked the 5 peak masters wasn't that Su Zimo had survived the 8 distresses. It was Su Zimo's slash. As perfected Jin Dan, when Xian and the other 4 could sense that the power released from that slash had already surpassed the full strength of a perfected chi refinement warrior. What sort of concept was that for a mortal to surpass a perfected chi refinement warrior with just the burst of his physical body? It was proof that this man's body was comparable to spirit beasts, and was even comparable to early-stage Foundation establishment spirit demons. Furthermore, Su Zimo's slash was way too murderous. There must be a lot of blood on his hands for him to be able to deliver that slash. How could a mortal be stained with so much blood? What shocked them even more was that Su Zimo had dared to strike at Xian Yi with such decisiveness. Su Zimo was only a mortal. As for perfected Jin Dan and the peak master of Array Peak, the fact that he could stand here meant that he was an immortal in the eyes of mortals. Su Zimo's slash had the intent to kill an immortal. Why did you attack me? Xian Yi glared at Su Zimo with bright eyes and asked in a deep voice. In that short period of time, Su Zimo had roughly guessed that just now, he had fallen into an illusion and everything he had experienced was nothing more than an illusion. Su Zimo lowered his head slightly. Just now I mistakenly thought that senior had attacked me and pushed me down the peak. That was the reason why I slashed. That answer was naturally within the expectations of the 5 peak masters as well. However, the more that was the case, the more the 5 of them felt troubled. This was an arrogant and unyielding man. It didn't matter if the other party was an immortal or had some sort of backing. If they offended him, he would kill them. In the eyes of the 5 of them, Su Zimo was like an unsheathed sword that could slice through metal like mud. Not only could he injure his enemies, he could even injure himself. It was hard to tell if it was a blessing or a curse for someone like him to join a sect. However, Su Zimo's temperament was hard to come by. His willpower was firm, and he had even endured the 8 distresses tribulation. Such a genius was hard to come by. If he were to miss out on the Misty Peak, he would be somewhat reluctant. What's more, Su Zimo had already passed the sect's 3 tests. The 5 peak masters looked at each other, unable to make up their minds. Logically speaking, spirit peaks when Xian would have accepted such a person as his disciple at the first opportunity. However, he did not say anything at this moment. After pondering for a moment, Wen Xian took out a spirit testing stone from his storage bag and handed it to Su Zimo. Test your spirit root again. Su Zimo held the spirit testing stone. The spirit testing stone glowed with a bright red light, emitting a trace of heat. The 5 peak masters nodded their heads after seeing this. Fire attribute, heavenly spirit root, that's right. Before the 5 of them could finish their thoughts, the spirit testing stone seemed to have caught on fire. In the blink of an eye, it turned into ashes and fell through the gaps between Su Zimo's fingers. Everyone was stunned on the spot. What was going on? The fat child was agitated as he pointed at Su Zimo. Peak Master, look. I was right, wasn't I? Even as perfected Jindan, the 5 peak masters had never seen anyone burn a spirit testing stone to ashes just for a spirit root test. Strange. Right then, an authoritative voice rang out in the minds of the 5 of them. This lad's killing intent is too strong and he's too sharp. Since he has a fire spirit root, we can let him join Weapon Peak and train him in weapon refinement. After that, we can make other plans. This was a voice transmission from the Patriarch of Misty Peak. Other than the 5 peak masters, no one else noticed it. Weapon Peak's peak master was the disheveled old man on the peak. The disheveled old man looked at Su Zimo and chuckled. Let's go. Follow me back to Weapon Peak. From now on, you'll be a trial disciple of Misty Peak and a member of Weapon Peak. All right. Su Zimo nodded. The haughty man, white-bloused woman and little fatty joined Spirit Peak naturally, while the remaining 3 mortals went to Elixir, Array and Talisman Peak respectively. Waving his greasy sleeves, the disheveled old man swept up Su Zimo and left the peak. Before long, Su Zimo was brought to Weapon Peak. The disheveled old man said, "From now on, I'll be your master. There aren't that many rules in Weapon Peak, so you can call me old man." Shui. Yes, you. Come here. The disheveled old man beckoned to a disciple who was passing by. The disciple called Shui was skinny and weak. Running over, he bowed to the disheveled old man and greeted respectfully, "Master. This is Su Zimo who has just joined the sect. He's your junior brother. Bring him to collect a sect badge and some items for trial disciples. Then bring him to choose a cave abode." After saying that, the disheveled old man flicked his sleeves and left. "I'll have to trouble you then, senior brother." Su Zimo cupped his fists. Shui smiled and waved it off. "It's fine, you're welcome." Bringing Su Zimo to a majestic pavilion, Shui introduced, "This is the symbol of Weapon Peak, the spirit weapon chamber. All trial disciples of the 5 peaks who want spirit weapons have to come here in exchange for them with contribution points. Contribution points are very important to the sect and can be used to exchange for spirit stones, elixirs and things like cultivation techniques and secret manuals." "How do I get contribution points?" Su Zimo asked. "Within the 5 peaks there's a mission steal. Every once in a while, missions will be updated, and they'll all be rewarded with contribution points. Of course, the more difficult it is, the more contribution points you'll get." Bringing Su Zimo to the spirit weapon chamber, Shui bowed to the old guard and said, "Senior, this is a new disciple of Weapon Peak. He's here to collect a sect badge." "Oh, name?" The old gatekeeper opened his sleepy eyes and asked weakly. "Su Zimo." The old guard took out a long jade badge from his storage bag. One side of it was engraved with mysterious patterns, while the other side was smooth and blank. Shooting out a stream of spirit chi from his fingertip, the old guard wrote 3 crooked words on the smooth side: Su Zimo. Tossing it aside casually, the old guard closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Receiving the badge, Su Zimo looked at it carefully and found nothing special about it. Shui smiled. "Junior brother, don't underestimate this sect badge. With it, you'll be able to enter and exit the sect freely. The fog outside won't be able to trap you either." Nodding his head, Su Zimo kept it carefully. Slapping his head, Shui seemed to have recalled something as he turned to the old guard and asked with a smile, "Senior, didn't you leave something out?" Without even opening his eyes, the old guard took out a storage bag and tossed it over. Receiving it, Shui handed it to Su Zimo and said, "Junior brother, there's a spirit peering art and a chi condensation manual inside. Apart from that, there's also 10 inferior grade spirit stones. Keep them well. Knowing that Su Zimo had not condensed his qi, Shui opened the storage bag and took out the 2 books, placing them in Su Zimo's hands. Summoning his flying sword, Shui got Su Zimo to hop on and brought him to the waist of the mountain. Pointing at the rows of cave abodes, he said, "We don't have many disciples in Weapon Peak and most of the cave abodes are empty. Junior brother, just pick one." At the thought that he still had to cultivate the mystic classic of the 12 demon kings of the great wilderness, Su Zimo chose a cave abode in a secluded corner and settled down at Misty Peak. Chapter 71. The cave abode was extremely spacious. After sitting quietly for a while, Su Zimo gradually calmed down from the joy of joining a sect. Imitating Shui, he hung the sect badge on his waist and took out the spirit-peering art and qi condensation manual. The spirit-peering art was the most basic cultivation technique in the cultivation world, and almost every cultivator had cultivated it before. By circulating spirit qi in their eyes, they could detect the cultivation realms of other cultivators. Of course, there were also some extremely rare cultivation techniques in the cultivation world that could conceal one's cultivation from the spirit-peering art. The qi condensation manual was considered as an introductory cultivation technique of ethereal sect. If one wanted to open their storage bags, cultivate the spirit-peering art, sword kinesis, flight, refine elixirs and weapons, they had to cultivate spirit qi first. Su Zimo had a fire spirit root, and the spirit qi he cultivated with the qi condensation manual naturally carried a fire attribute. Before leaving, Shui told Su Zimo that there would be a grand entrance ceremony 10 days later in front of Ethereal Palace on the main peak of Misty Peak. Not only would many seniors of the sect be present, even the patriarch would be there. All the new disciples would have to attend as well. Su Zimo intended to cultivate a trace of spirit qi and reach level 1 qi condensation before the grand entrance ceremony. The thought of being able to fly on his sword once he condensed his qi without having to flee pathetically from cultivators made Su Zimo's blood boil. In fact, he even wanted to roar into the skies. Opening the qi condensation manual slowly, lines of words entered his eyes as Su Zimo gradually immersed himself in it. The first step of the qi condensation manual was to create a sense of qi. Spirit qi was omnipresent, just like breathing air. However, without a spirit root, one would not be able to sense the existence of spirit qi. According to the instructions of the qi condensation manual, after 15 minutes, Su Zimo gradually sensed a scorching aura in the air that flowed around him. It was a fresh, unique and unprecedented feeling. So this is spirit qi. Su Zimo's mind was in a state of shock. Suddenly, the sensation disappeared and he could no longer sense that scorching energy. Su Zimo's eyes flashed with a trace of confusion. After pondering for a while, he gradually understood. The first part of the qi condensation manual was written with 4 words. Calm the heart and condense the qi. Only with a calm heart could one feel the existence of spiritual energy. If one was distracted, this feeling would dissipate. No matter what, Su Zimo had already achieved the first step of the qi condensation technique, sensing qi. He could finally put down one of his worries. After all, the fire spiritual root in his body was indeed a little strange. Not only could it incinerate the spirit testing stone, it could even destroy the spirit testing gate at the entrance of the sect. Before this, Su Zimo had been a little worried about whether the acquired spiritual root would have the same effect as the natural spiritual root. Now it seemed that his worries were unnecessary. The second step of qi condensation was to draw qi into the body. It wasn't enough to sense the spirit qi. He had to control the spirit qi and guide it into his body. The third step of the qi condensation technique, qi entering the dantian. After drawing the spiritual qi into the body, one had to control the spiritual qi to sink into the dantian. Only in this way could one prevent the spiritual qi from dissipating in the body and becoming one's own spiritual qi. At this step, one would be at level 1 qi condensation. Su Zimo abandoned all distractions and calmed his heart. He tried his best to sense the spiritual qi in the air, and gradually guided it into his body. All of a sudden, Su Zimo's right hand produced a warmth as a spiritual qi entered his body through his right hand. Interesting. The qi condensation technique did not state where the spiritual qi would enter the body. However, Su Zimo was still intrigued by the fact that the spiritual qi entered his body through his palm. When the spiritual qi entered his body, It was rather active and wandered around without listening to his commands. Su Zimo hurriedly controlled it and forced the spiritual qi into his dantian. The dantian was like a treasure trove in one's body. The moment the spiritual qi entered the dantian, it calmed down. Level 1 qi condensation. Su Zimo opened his eyes. There was a hint of excitement and disbelief in the depths of his eyes. Night had just fallen. In other words, Su Zimo had only cultivated for less than 2 hours. Su Zimo felt that it was surreal to be able to reach level 1 qi condensation in such a short period of time. Seems like a heaven spirit root is truly amazing. Su Zimo smiled. Su Zimo was in a good state after condensing his qi condensation. Without resting, he continued to cultivate and absorb spiritual qi towards level 2 qi condensation. His right hand was still warm as spiritual qi entered his body through his right hand continuously. Under Su Zimo's control, it gushed towards his dantian. Su Zimo was immersed in his cultivation. In the blink of an eye, a night had passed. Level 2 qi condensation. In just a single night, Su Zimo had reached level 2 qi condensation. Isn't this a little too fast? Could it be that the cultivation speed of a heaven spirit root is that fast? Su Zimo was stunned. After all, he did not know how fast others cultivated. He only had a vague feeling that it was abnormal for him to cultivate so quickly. After all, Su Zimo had not made use of spirit stones or elixirs for the entire night. If he were to absorb spirit stones and elixirs, wouldn't his cultivation speed be even faster? Su Zimo could not figure it out. He decided to put it aside for now and ask his senior brothers when he had the chance. At the thought of spirit stones, Su Zimo's heart skipped a beat. Before leaving Pingyang town, Su Zimo had killed Zhou Dingyun and obtained a storage bag from him. Now that Su Zimo was at level 2 qi condensation, he could finally use a storage bag. Su Zimo took out Zhou Dingyun's storage bag from his chest. A trace of spirit qi seeped out from his fingertip and touched the storage bag gently. He opened the storage bag and a space appeared. There were more than 1,300 inferior-grade spirit stones and a jade bottle. There was nothing else. Su Zimo opened the jade bottle. There were 3 elixirs inside, emitting a faint fragrance. Smelling the fragrance of the elixirs, the spiritual qi in his dantian that was originally quiet became restless. Su Zimo understood that these 3 elixirs were definitely beneficial for the absorption of spiritual qi. For Su Zimo, who had just condensed his qi, this was a considerable amount of wealth. Su Zimo placed all the spirit stones and elixirs into the storage bag, given to him by the sect. He also stuffed the sanguine crystal bow, cold moon saber and the quiver on his back into the storage bag. After removing the 1,000 kilogram weight, Su Zimo instantly felt relaxed. No matter how heavy the items were, he could not feel their weight in the storage bag. This was the magical part of the storage bag. Su Zimo activated the spirit-peering art and started cultivating. In the following days, Su Zimo cultivated the qi condensation technique in the day, and the marrow cleansing section of the mystic classic of the 12 demon kings of the great wilderness at night. In the blink of an eye, 10 days had passed. This was the day that the sect held the entrance ceremony for Su Zimo and the rest. Su Zimo tidied his clothes and leaped down from the stone bed. 10 days had passed and Su Zimo's cultivation realm had declined. Right now, he was back at level 1 qi condensation. In reality, on the 7th day, Su Zimo's cultivation realm had already reached level 4 qi condensation. There was a huge ball of spiritual qi in his dantian that was as vast as the sea. Su Zimo suddenly recalled that Dai Yu had once told him that some geniuses among the cultivators would use spiritual qi to temper their bodies while cultivating. For the next 3 days, Su Zimo used all the spiritual qi in his body to temper his body. There was only a strand left in his dantian. Even though there was no progress in the marrow cleansing section, Su Zimo's body was much stronger than it was 10 days ago. Su Zimo estimated that even a level 10 perfected qi refinement warrior with an inferior grade spirit weapon would not be able to hurt him. Chapter 72. Junior brother Su, I'm Shui. Are you in? A voice sounded from outside the cave abode. It was senior brother Shui who had brought Su Zimo around Weapon Peak in the beginning. Su Zimo pushed open the door hurriedly and headed out. This time around, Su Zimo instinctively used his spirit-peering art to sense that Shui was a level 9 Qi refinement warrior. Shui looked at Su Zimo and his expression changed. Disbelief flashed through his eyes as he asked, "Junior brother Su, you're already at level 1 Qi condensation?" Su Zimo could not understand what Shui meant by that, and nodded because he knew that he might slip up if he spoke too much. "Wow, that's amazing!" Shui could not help but exclaim. Su Zimo was stunned. Was it amazing to be at level 1 Qi condensation in 10 days? If Su Zimo did not temper his body with spirit Qi, he would have been at level 5 Qi condensation by now. Su Zimo coughed gently and asked, "Senior brother, how long do others take to reach level 1 Qi condensation?" "That depends on the attribute of the spirit root. For example, I have an earth spirit root, and it took me an entire month to reach level 1 Qi condensation. Among the first 3 steps of Qi condensation, sensing and drawing Qi into one's body are the most difficult. Beginners have a hard time grasping them as they either can't sense the presence of spirit Qi, or can't draw it into their body. That requires a long period of cultivation, experimentation and exploration," Shui explained. Although Su Zimo was expressionless on the surface, he was even more puzzled internally. Sensing and drawing Qi into his body were not difficult at all for him. How could it be, as Shui said? Could that be the benefit of having a heaven spirit root? At that thought, Su Zimo smiled. "Perhaps it's because I have a heaven spirit root that I can cultivate faster." "That's right." Shui nodded in realization. It's indeed much easier for those with a heaven spirit root to cultivate Qi condensation. I heard that the fastest geniuses can reach level 1 Qi condensation in a single day. However, don't be discouraged, junior brother. Reaching level 1 Qi condensation in 10 days is already very fast. Su Zimo smiled and nodded. In reality, Su Zimo took less than 2 hours to reach level 1 Qi condensation. According to Shui, even the genius with the fastest cultivation speed would need a day. How could this be? He thought about the explosion of the spirit testing gate, the incineration of the spirit testing stone, the terrifying cultivation speed, and all kinds of strange phenomena. The only explanation was that the celestial spiritual root that Dai Yu had planted in him was even stronger than the real celestial spiritual root. "I won't be able to teach you in the future, so I helped you plant a spirit root. It won't be any worse than a celestial spirit root. In the future you should find a sect to cultivate in." When Dai Yu had said this, she had sounded very casual, and even a little nonchalant. It was only now that Su Zimo realized how terrifying the spirit root that Dai Yu had planted for him was. Suddenly, Shui frowned and asked in confusion, "That's not right. Junior brother, you have a heaven spirit root. Why would you join Weapon Peak? Shouldn't you join Spirit Peak instead?" "What's the difference?" Su Zimo asked. "There's a huge difference." Shui chuckled. "It's almost time for the sect entrance ceremony. I'll bring you there first. I'll tell you along the way." Summoning a flying sword, Shui called for Su Zimo and they sped towards Misty Peak. Along the way, Su Zimo found out from Shui that even though the 5 peaks had their own strengths, Spirit Peak was the strongest and had the most disciples, followed by Talisman Peak and Array Peak. The weakest were Elixir Peak and Weapon Peak. Spirit Peak specialized in combat, and logically speaking, all those with celestial spiritual roots would join Spirit Peak. Be it elixir refinement or weapon refinement, there was an extremely high requirement for fire. However, Misty Peak was not proficient in controlling fire. Among the 5 major sects, True Fire Sect was the one with the deepest understanding of fire. The Great Zhou Dynasty would hold a sect competition once every 10 years. All the sects in the dynasty would participate and set up 4 great rankings, namely the Spirit Ranking, Artifact Ranking, Alchemy Ranking, and Talisman Ranking. The top 10 of each ranking would be listed. With more than 100 sects and thousands of cultivators, they would definitely be the elites of their respective sections. Yet, only 40 people would be chosen. Not only was it a great honor to be able to leave one's name on the 4 lists, they would also be rewarded handsomely, proving that they were the true geniuses of the Great Zhou Dynasty. In every sect competition, Ethereal Sect would take up the most spots on the Spirit Ranking, followed by the Talisman Ranking. However, no one had ever left their names on the Weapon and Elixir rankings. That was why Shui could not understand why Su Zimo was assigned to Weapon Peak, even though he possessed a celestial spiritual root. Su Zimo could vaguely guess that there were 2 reasons. Firstly, he had damaged the sect's spirit testing gate. Secondly, he had once attacked Peak Master Xianyi. Although this arrangement was meant to be a punishment, Su Zimo did not take it to heart. According to Shui Yi, all the Qi refinement warriors in Ethereal sect were trial disciples, and could not freely enter Misty Peak, which was surrounded by the 5 peaks. Only by becoming a Foundation Establishment cultivator would one be considered an inner sect disciple of Misty Peak, and have the chance to obtain middle-grade spirit weapons and better cultivation techniques. Given Su Zimo's cultivation speed, it would only take him a few years to become an inner sect disciple. Before long, Su Zimo and Shui Yi arrived at Misty Peak. Not far away, a majestic palace stood, faintly discernible in the clouds. Above the palace there was a plaque with 3 words written on it, Misty Palace. Shui Yi led Su Zimo towards Ethereal Palace. By the side of the road, there was a crane statue standing on one leg with its eyes closed. It was 100 feet tall and had a massive body, exuding a dignified aura. The feathers on its body shone with a metallic luster, looking lifelike. Compared to this gigantic statue, Su Zimo and Shui Yi were as tiny as ants. Looking at the statue, Su Zimo felt that it looked familiar. However, he did not think too much about it and merely praised from the bottom of his heart. I wonder who made this statue. It's a work of the gods and looks exactly the same as a real crane. Shoo! When he heard that, Shui Yi's expression changed as he hurriedly gestured for Su Zimo to keep quiet. What's wrong? Su Zimo asked softly with an uneasy feeling in his heart. Shui Yi wiped his sweat and said softly, "That's not a statue. That's the mystical guardian beast of Ethereal sect. It's alive." Alive? Su Zimo coughed gently and looked up with an awkward expression. The crane stood there motionlessly, and Su Zimo's first thought was that it was a statue. What's it doing here then? Su Zimo asked again. Shui Yi shook his head and said, I'm not sure either. Typically speaking, Senior Crane stays in Ethereal Palace, and it's rare for ordinary disciples to get a chance to meet it. It seems like we're fated to meet today. Pausing for a moment, Shui Yi looked around with a sneaky expression and whispered in a low voice, however, I heard that Senior Crane's child was bullied by a new disciple some time ago, and it was so angry that it cried. Perhaps it's here to find trouble with that disciple. I wonder which unlucky bastard it was. Suddenly, Su Zimo stopped in his tracks and turned around slowly. Blinking, he asked, Is Senior Crane's child a crane as well? Isn't that obvious? Of course it is. Shui Yi laughed. Su Zimo could not laugh anymore. Chapter 73. When Shui Yi saw Su Zimo stop in his tracks with a strange expression, he asked softly, Junior brother Su, what's wrong? You don't look too good. Su Zimo did not reply. As though he had thought of something, Shui Yi gasped and pointed at Su Zimo with a trembling voice. That unlucky brat. It can't be you, right? Right then, Su Zimo felt a chill run down his spine and his scalp tingled. It was as though he was being targeted by an incomparably strong existence. Su Zimo's body stiffened and his limbs turned cold. Turning around slowly, he raised his head. Unknowingly, the gigantic crane not far behind them had opened its eyes and was looking over with a cold gaze. In front of the crane, Su Zimo felt incomparably insignificant, not only in terms of size but also in terms of strength. If the crane wanted to kill him, it did not even have to make a move. A single thought was enough. The air around them seemed to have frozen and a murderous intent gradually spread, as though the world could collapse at any moment. All of a sudden, the crane spread its wings and soared into the skies, flying over Su Zimo and Shui Yi's heads towards Ethereal Palace. Its gigantic wings covered almost half the skies as the wind howled and sand flew everywhere. In the blink of an eye, the crane disappeared into Ethereal Palace. In those few short breaths, Shui Yi's face was pale and he was drenched in sweat, almost fainting from fright. Shui Yi could not help but look towards Su Zimo. Su Zimo stood on the spot without a change in expression. The only difference was that his face was slightly pale and his eyes were indifferent. Junior brother Su, aren't you afraid? Shui Yi could not help but ask. Su Zimo shook his head. If Senior Crane wanted to kill me, it would have done so long ago. Why wait until now and even come to Ethereal Palace to wait for me? That's true, Shui Yi panted slightly and nodded. Suddenly, Su Zimo asked, What's Senior Crane's cultivation realm? I don't know, but its child is a spirit demon, equivalent to an early-stage foundation establishment cultivator. Let me tell you, Senior Crane's child has an extraordinary bloodline. He's still in his infancy and has already reached early-stage foundation establishment without cultivating much. If he grows up, he'll be incredible. Shuiyi's words were also meant to remind Su Zimo to be careful in the future. Not long after, the haughty man, the white-clothed woman, Little Fatty, and the others arrived before the Misty Palace. Little Fatty's eyes lit up when he saw Su Zimo. He greeted him and ran over. "Not bad, big bro. You're already at Qi condensation level 1, said Little Fatty with a grin. The arrogant man and the lady in white glanced at Su Zimo. Their expressions were indifferent. To them, reaching the first level of Qi condensation in 10 days was nothing special. Using his spirit-peering art, Su Zimo checked on the others. In 10 days, the arrogant man and the white-clothed woman had already broken through to level 6 Qi condensation. Little Fatty was still at level 5 Qi condensation. As for the other 3 trial disciples, none of them were at Qi condensation yet. I still don't know your name. Su Zimo started chatting with Little Fatty when he saw that the sect entrance ceremony had yet to begin. Little Fatty had a rare awkward expression as he chuckled dryly. My surname is Pang and my name is Z. Su Zimo was stunned for a long time. Holding back his laughter, he praised. Your name is like your person. What a good name. Heh. Little Fatty pointed to the arrogant man and whispered. That arrogant fella is called Feng Haoyu and that ice beauty beside him is called Lung Ro. Big bro, have you noticed? Noticed what? Look, that fella's surname is Feng, meaning that he has a wind spirit root. That ice beauty's surname is Lung, meaning that she has an ice spirit root. I've already thought about it. My son won't have the surname Pang. He'll have the surname Lei Guang Dark and so on. He'll be born with a mutated spirit root. Hey, just thinking about it makes me happy. Su Zimo. In just a short while, many cultivators had gathered in front of Ethereal Palace. Most of them were Foundation Establishment cultivators or inner sect disciples of Misty Peak. There were also some cultivators who soared into the air. They were clearly perfected Jin Dan. The 5 Peak Masters were among them as well. They stood in front of Ethereal Palace, leaving the middle seats empty. Before long, the sound of a bell rang from Ethereal Palace, reverberating through the 5 peaks and valleys. Accompanied by the sound of the bell, an old man in his 50s dressed in golden robes walked over slowly from Ethereal Palace. Standing at the entrance, he swept his gaze across Su Zimo's group of 7. For some reason, Su Zimo felt that the golden-robed old man's gaze seemed to linger on him for a while longer. I'm the Patriarch of Misty Peak, Ling Yun. Even though Misty Peak is one of the 5 major sects of the Great Zhou Dynasty, everyone should know that we're currently standing on Tianhuang mainland. It's divided into 4 regions, 3 seas and 1 continent. The Great Zhou Dynasty is only a dynasty in the north region of Tianhuang mainland. There are 3 other dynasties that are similar to it in terms of strength. Su Zimo's mouth was agape in shock. Back in Pingyang town, the Great Zhou Dynasty was already something that he could only look up to. It was only now that Su Zimo realized that compared to the entire Tianhuang mainland, the Great Zhou Dynasty and Ethereal Sect were nothing. If he were to continue staying in Pingyang town, he would be like a frog in a well, forever only able to see the palm-sized skies. Of course, given Su Zimo's current strength, he could not even roam freely within the borders of the Great Zhou Dynasty, let alone 4 regions, 3 seas and 1 continent. When he saw the shock in the eyes of Su Zimo and the others, the Patriarch of Misty Peak, Ling Yun, nodded and continued, among the 7 of you, some of you are already at level 6 Qi condensation while some of you have yet to do so. There's no need to feel discouraged if your cultivation is lagging behind. The path of cultivation is long and bumpy. Now that you guys have just started, it doesn't mean that you'll have a future just because you're lagging behind now. After Qi condensation is foundation establishment. After that is the major realm of cultivation, core formation. After forming a core, your lifespan will increase to 500 years, and you'll shed your mortal body to become a perfected being. After core formation, there's the nascent soul realm where your lifespan will increase to 1,000 years. At nascent soul, you'll be known as a perfected lord. You'll be able to open up your spirit consciousness and cultivate your spirit consciousness. Even if you can't see, you'll be able to sense everything around you, and your spirit consciousness will be all-pervasive, covering the entire world. After nascent soul is void reversion. After establishing your Tao heart, you'll be able to refine your spirit into the void. Your nascent soul will be cleansed of all impurities and undergo a qualitative change to form your essence spirit. Your essence spirit will be transparent and unafraid of the scorching sun. You'll be able to truly break free from the shackles of your physical body and roam the world with your spirit. It's equivalent to having an additional life, and you can possess someone else's body and cultivate an external body with a lifespan of 5,000 years. At void reversion realm, you'll be known as a Taoist. When he heard that, Su Zimo's heart skipped a beat. The mystic classic of the 12 demon kings of the great wilderness had a total of 9 sections. The 7th section was on core formation, the 8th section was on Yin spirit, and the 9th section was on Yang spirit. The Yin spirit section said that one would be able to see the spirit after breaking through the voids. Was the word voids the spirit consciousness that Ling Yun mentioned? Did the Yin spirit correspond to the nascent soul of cultivation? The Yang spirit section said that one would be able to refine the dregs of the Yin spirit and obtain a pure Yang spirit without Yin. That would be the Yang spirit. In the later stages, one could even communicate with the power of heaven and earth and conjure a heaven and earth dharma form. Did the Yang spirit correspond to the essence spirit of cultivation? Su Zimo lowered his head and tried his best to hide the shock in his eyes. If he cultivated both immortality and demonic, there was a high possibility that he would have 2 Jin Dan in the future and 2 essence spirits. Chapter 74. There's an even higher realm above the void reversion realm where you can summon clouds and rain with the flip of your hand. With a single thought, you can reverse the flow of rivers, burn the skies and boil the seas, shift the stars and travel thousands of miles with a single step. Those words had Su Zimo's group of 7 feeling emotional as they imagined themselves roaming the skies and looking down on the world. Who wouldn't yearn for such power? Many of the inner sect disciples present had already heard those words many times, and they could still feel their blood boiling. The patriarch of Misty Peak, Ling Yun, said in a deep voice, "Go back and cultivate well. At the end of every year, the sect will organize a face-off between the 5 peaks with great rewards. Even though the 7 of you have just joined the sect, be it in terms of spirit roots or potential, they are all excellent. I hope that some of you will be able to take part in this year's face-off and obtain a placing." On the way back to Weapon Peak, Su Zimo asked Shui, "What's the deal with the 5 peaks face-off?" Shui chuckled. In reality, it's to choose the number 1 of the 5 peaks. For example, the Weapon Peak face-off is a competition between disciples of Weapon Peak. The number 1 disciple can choose any inferior grade spirit weapon from the spirit weapon chamber. As for Elixir Peak, it's a competition of elixirs. The number 1 disciple can obtain a grade 1 elixir such as the spirit gathering elixir. Frowning, Su Zimo asked, "If multiple disciples can refine inferior grade spirit weapons, how are they going to differentiate?" Haha. Shui burst into laughter. If a disciple can refine an inferior grade spirit weapon, he'll definitely be the number 1 of Weapon Peak. Junior brother Su, you haven't come into contact with weapon refinement yet, so it's extremely difficult for you to refine an inferior grade spirit weapon. I've never heard of any disciple being able to refine an inferior grade spirit weapon in the Weapon Peak face-off every year. Everyone would refine pseudo-spirit weapons and master would judge which pseudo-spirit weapon is better. Su Zimo nodded. Shui continued, "Actually, the other 4 peaks are just a setup for the 5 peaks face-off. The one that everyone pays attention to the most is still Spirit Peaks face-off, where disciples fight in pairs and compete in terms of strength. That's what's interesting, and the rewards are the best. Not only will they be rewarded with an inferior grade spirit weapon, a grade 1 elixir, a grade 1 talisman and a number of spirit stones. Junior brother Su, don't think about these things. After all, regardless of whether it's alchemy or equipment refinement, both consume a great deal of energy and time. It's better not to neglect the essentials and focus on trifles. Calming down and cultivating is the right path." Su Zimo did not refute Shui's words, but he disapproved in his heart. After becoming an alchemist, one would be able to concoct pills, which would be beneficial to one's cultivation. After becoming a weapon refiner, one would be able to refine spirit artifacts, and it would also greatly increase one's strength. Most importantly, Suzimo possessed the fire spiritual root. His cultivation speed was extremely fast, which would save him a lot of time. In the 5 peaks, there would be inner sect disciples coming to the 5 peaks every day to teach and clear their doubts. Suzimo returned to Weapon Peak and listened carefully to an inner sect disciple's explanation on the art of weapon crafting before returning to his cave abode. The foundation of refining weapons was to first cultivate the spiritual fire. Spiritual fire was a flame that was ignited with spiritual energy as its foundation. There were 3 levels of spiritual fire, which were differentiated by color: light red, dark red, and crimson red. The darker the color, the higher the temperature of the flame. Naturally, it could refine more impurities in the equipment. Above the spiritual fire was the true fire, which was divided into light gold, dark gold, and pure gold. The first step of weapon crafting was to choose the materials. Be it for elixir or weapon crafting, the materials used were all natural treasures that contained spiritual energy. The second step was smelting. Elixir refinement required a special furnace known as an elixir furnace. However, weapon crafting required a tripod known as a weapon tripod. Be it elixir furnaces or weapon tripods, they were made of special materials that were resistant to fire and would not melt. After placing the selected materials into the weapon tripod and smelting them with spirit fire, the materials would be melted into liquid form and fused together to refine the impurities in the materials. The third step was shaping. This step required one to control the temperature and lower it slowly. Before the molten metal in the weapon tripod solidified, one would have to shape the spirit weapon they wanted. Of course, if one were to craft some special weapons, this step would require even more effort. However, if it was an ordinary flying sword, it would be much simpler. The fourth step was tempering. The temperature was raised once more. Within the weapon tripod, one would make use of the impact of spirit chi and the roasting of flames to refine the impurities, making the spirit weapon even tougher. The fifth step was spirit gathering. Spirit gathering was the core of the entire weapon refinement process, and was also the most difficult step. Within the weapon tripod, the spirit chi released by the melting of the materials was extremely pure under the continuous roasting of the spirit fire. The spirit chi had to be gathered on the spirit weapon once more and refined into it. A series of spirit patterns would appear on the spirit weapon. That was also the origin of the grades of spirit weapons. An inferior grade spirit weapon would be formed if it could form a single spirit pattern. A supreme grade spirit weapon would be formed if it could form 4 spirit patterns. The reason why spirit gathering was so difficult was because if it failed, the spirit weapon would explode in the tripod and all the previous effort would be for naught. Furthermore, the failure rate of spirit gathering was extremely high. The more spirit patterns one condensed, the higher the failure rate. The sixth step was tempering. This step was extremely simple. One had to place the spirit weapon in cold water for it to take shape. Suzimo extended his left hand and channeled the spirit chi in his dantian, creating a weak flame in his palm. The flame was faint red and emitted a scorching temperature. However, his palm did not feel hot at all. Level 1 Spirit Fire. Suzimo smiled. The spirit fire disappeared along with the dissipation of the spirit chi. Circulating his spirit chi, a flame appeared in his palm once more as Suzimo practiced tirelessly. Suddenly, Suzimo's heart skipped a beat as he recalled something. Back in Pingyang Town, perfected being Song Lang released a scarlet flame from his fingertip, burning Zhui Feng to ashes. It was only at this moment that Suzimo realized that the flame was a level 3 spirit fire. At the thought of Zhui Feng's death, Suzimo's eyes dimmed and he felt dejected as well. In terms of immortal cultivation, he had only just attained level 1 chi condensation. In terms of demonic cultivation, he had not made any progress in the marrow cleansing section even after such a long time. He did not know how long it would take for him to seek revenge for Zhui Feng. Dai Yu once said that the mystic classic of the 12 demon kings of the Great Wilderness would get more difficult towards the end. Without her around, Suzimo would not be able to master it. But now, Suzimo was already stuck at the marrow cleansing section after the bone strengthening section, let alone the organs refinement and orifice clearing sections. Suzimo fell into deep thought and a ball of spirit fire appeared in his right palm instinctively. Swoosh! A ball of flame rose and the scarlet flame was a little blinding. Shocked, Su Zimo swung his palm and dispersed the spirit chi along with the flame. The flame earlier on didn't seem to be faint red? Frowning, Su Zimo stared at his right palm and circulated his spirit chi, creating a spirit fire once more. Swoosh! The flame rose. The bright flame shone on Su Zimo's stunned face. Scarlet, level 3 spirit fire. Chapter 75. How could this be? Su Zimo stared at the scarlet flame in his right palm in deep thought. Of course, he did not think that he was exceptionally talented and managed to attain a level 3 spirit fire right after cultivating it. However, what was the reason for this to happen? Su Zimo's heart skipped a beat. Opening his left hand, he channeled spirit chi and conjured a flame in his palm. Swoosh! A faint red flame rose. Level 1 spirit fire. 2 balls of flames burned in Su Zimo's palms. However, their colors were completely different and the temperature they emitted was vastly different as well. Su Zimo retracted the flame in his palm and tried a few more times. Each time the flame conjured in his left palm was a level 1 spirit fire. However, he could conjure a level 3 spirit fire in his right palm. Su Zimo recalled a detail from the beginning of chi condensation. The second step of chi condensation was to draw chi into the body. Back then, the spirit chi in the air entered his body through his right hand. What did that mean? Su Zimo frowned slightly and looked at his right hand repeatedly. However, he could not find anything amiss. After pondering for a moment, Su Zimo had no clue and buried that doubt in his heart. No matter what, it was not a bad thing to possess a level 3 spirit fire right after coming into contact with weapon refinement. The higher the level of the spirit fire, the better the effect of removing impurities when smelting spirit materials. Under normal circumstances, there was a high chance that a level 3 spirit fire could be used to refine middle-grade spirit weapons. Of course, for weapon refinement masters, the level of the spirit fire was only one of the most important aspects. One had to know how to control the spirit fire, temperature, heat and the core of spirit gathering. As long as a single mistake was made in any of the 6 steps of weapon refinement, it would be difficult to refine a middle-grade spirit weapon. For weapon refinement masters, those who could refine inferior-grade spirit weapons were elementary weapon refinement masters. Those who could refine middle-grade spirit weapons were intermediate weapon refinement masters. Only those who could refine superior-grade spirit weapons could be considered as advanced weapon refinement masters. Most perfected Jindan cultivators would only use superior-grade spirit weapons. Therefore, in the cultivation world, if one could become an advanced weapon refinement master, their status would be equivalent to Jindan cultivators. In fact, in terms of connections and reputation, they would be even wider than ordinary Jindan cultivators. As for the refinement of supreme-grade spirit weapons, the failure rate was too high. Even an advanced refiner would not dare to take it on lightly. For the rest of the time, Su Zimo received a weapon tripod from the old guard as a disciple of Weapon Peak. He spent most of his time in his cave abode practicing his weapon refinement techniques, occasionally cultivating his chi condensation to raise his cultivation realm. At night, he continued to study the marrow cleansing section. 1 month later, Su Zimo's cultivation had reached the 5th level of chi condensation, and he was quite proficient in the art of forging. He had successfully forged a few pseudo-spirit-grade flying swords, but he had made no progress with the marrow cleansing chapter. To be more precise, he didn't even have a clue. According to the marrow cleansing chapter, the sound of tigers and leopards would vibrate the marrow to achieve the effect of cleansing the marrow and exchanging the blood. Having lived in the Tsonglang mountain range for a year, Su Zimo was very familiar with the sounds of tigers and leopards. However, no matter how he imitated the roars of tigers and leopards, he could not achieve the effect of marrow cleansing. After a month, Su Zimo's throat was already hoarse from all the shouting. Su Zimo could vaguely sense that he might not have learned the correct direction. Therefore, he wanted to find a chance to catch a tiger or leopard to study the sounds of tigers and leopards. This day, Su Zimo walked out of his cave abode. At the end of every month, there would be a simple test among the 5 peaks. It wasn't compulsory and disciples of the various peaks were free to participate. The first place of the test would have a chance to observe the recordings left behind by the seniors of the sect during weapon refinement. Every weapon refinement master had a different method. The tempering step especially was carried out within the weapon tripod. It was the most secretive and would not be shown to others easily. For the past month, Su Zimo had many doubts. If he could observe the recordings left behind by the seniors of the sect during weapon refinement, it would be of great help to him. Before long, Su Zimo arrived at the weapon refinement hall of Weapon Peak on his flying sword. At a glance, there were more than 100 people. There were only dozens of trial disciples in Weapon Peak. Where did the others come from? Junior brother Su, you're here. Right then, Shui walked over from the side and greeted Su Zimo with a smile. Not bad. You're already at level 5 Qi condensation. Shui praised before asking why. Are you here for the end-of-month test as well? Yes, I want to give it a try, Su Zimo nodded. Alright, it's good that you're here too. Take a look at others' weapon refinement techniques and learn from them. Shui thought that Su Zimo was just here to join in the fun since he had just come into contact with weapon refinement. Senior brother Shui, there are only dozens of disciples in Weapon Peak. Why are there so many people for a single test? Su Zimo asked. Shui smiled. In the sect, disciples of the other 4 peaks who are interested in weapon refinement can come to Weapon Peak to listen to lectures, participate in the end-of-month test or even the 5 peaks face-off at the end of the year. After all, for some geniuses, they would choose to refine weapons, elixirs, talismans and formations while cultivating. Su Zimo nodded. That was what he thought as well. Su Zimo's gaze swept through the crowd casually before landing on a man in purple robes. The purple-robed man had a proud expression as he raised his head slightly with his eyes closed. Even if he was in the crowd, he could still be seen. This was the person who joined the sect at the same time as Su Zimo, and possessed a variant wind spirit root Feng Haoyu. After a month, Feng Haoyu had already advanced from level 6 Qi condensation to level 7. Shui followed Su Zimo's gaze and said, I heard that this person is hailed as the #1 genius of ethereal sect in the past 1,000 years. Coupled with his heaven-defying spirit root and extraordinary talent, many seniors of the sect have high hopes for him. I heard that he's going to take part in the 5 peaks face-off at the end of the year, and even declared that he's going to be #1 of 3 peaks. #1 of 3 peaks? Su Zimo furrowed his brows. Shui explained, even though he's a new disciple, he has a wind spirit root. Even if he's not at perfected level 10 by the end of the year, he'll definitely be a level 9 Qi refinement warrior. The only person who can compete with him in Spirit Peak is a woman called Lung Ro. I heard that she's a new disciple as well. Even if he can get #1 of Spirit Peak, what about the other 2 peaks? Su Zimo asked again. Shui lamented. One is Elixir Peak and the other is our Weapon Peak. Those 2 peaks are the weakest in the sect. Now that Feng Haoyu has appeared, it's a good thing for the sect. However, we're disciples of Weapon Peak after all. If he takes #1, we'll definitely feel uncomfortable. Su Zimo was puzzled and asked, Feng Haoyu has a wind spirit root. In terms of his control over fire, can he compare to disciples with fire spirit roots in Weapon Peak? Junior brother, do you know that no matter what type of spirit root one has, one can condense spirit fire? Shui asked. Su Zimo nodded. Even without a fire spirit root, one could still condense spirit fire. It was just that in terms of perception, cultivation and control over fire, it wouldn't be as easy and sharp as cultivators with fire spirit roots. Shui continued. That's what Feng Haoyu is relying on when his fire lends itself to the wind. Realization dawned on Su Zimo. Under the influence of the wind, the flames would naturally burn even more fiercely. Shui whispered again. I heard that Feng Haoyu has already cultivated a level 2 spirit fire. Su Zimo froze for a moment before looking at his right hand and nodding. That's pretty amazing. Chapter 76. It's not just pretty impressive. It's pretty impressive. Shui sighed softly. I've been in ethereal sect for 6 years, and I've only just touched the edge of a level 2 spirit fire. Let's not talk about that anymore. Shui perked up and shrugged. If Feng Haoyu can truly achieve something in both elixir and weapon refinement, and help Misty Peak leave their names on the elixir and weapon rankings of the sect competition, we'll be proud as well. Right? Su Zimo smiled and nodded. Everyone, please be silent. Right then, a Foundation Establishment cultivator appeared at the front of the weapon refinement hall. Pressing down with both hands, The noise in the hall gradually disappeared. Everyone, please come forward and choose your materials before dispersing. Choose an empty spot in the hall and begin your weapon refinement. The test has officially begun. The 100 sect disciples dispersed one after another after selecting their spirit materials. Su Zimo and Shui chose a spot at the back of the hall. Hands behind his back, Feng Haoyu stood at the front with a prideful expression. No one dared to stand beside him. Prior to this, Feng Haoyu had already asked around and found out that none of the trial disciples of the Five Peaks had managed to cultivate a level 2 spirit fire. The best of them had only just touched the edge of it. Feng Haoyu was confident that he would definitely be able to get number 1 in the end-of-the-month test and obtain the right to watch the recordings left behind by the seniors of the sect. Boom! Taking out his weapon tripod from his storage bag, Feng Haoyu slammed it on the ground heavily, causing the entire hall to shake. Every single action of Feng Haoyu attracted everyone's attention. The 100-odd sect disciples participating in the test were not in a hurry to refine their weapons. After placing their weapon tripods, their gazes landed on Feng Haoyu. Feng Haoyu's lips curled slightly. Even though he did not turn around, he could sense the burning, jealous and envious gazes. Feng Haoyu enjoyed that feeling. The feeling of being the center of attention. Reaching out slowly, Feng Haoyu channeled his spirit qi. A ball of flame rose. It was a faint red level 1 spirit fire. The entire hall was silent as everyone watched the person at the front with bated breaths. Swoosh! Feng Haoyu extended his other hand and shot out a stream of spirit qi from his fingertip into the flames. With a whoosh, the flame in Feng Haoyu's palm burned brightly. Its color gradually darkened, and before long, it had completely turned dark red. Level 2 spirit fire. Whoosh! Even though many sect disciples had already heard about it, they were still shocked to see the level 2 spirit fire with their own eyes. The crowd was in an uproar. With a level 2 spirit fire, the success rate of refining low-grade spirit weapons would increase greatly. Many cultivators would never be able to touch it in their entire lives. Sensing the commotion in the crowd, a gleeful look flashed through Feng Haoyu's eyes. With a wave of his palm, the level 2 spirit fire floated to the weapon tripod and continued to burn, warming the cauldron. First, he used the spirit fire to evenly heat the surroundings of the weapon crafting cauldron. After the temperature had spread throughout the entire cauldron, he placed the spiritual materials in. The process of weapon refinement was relatively long. At that moment, many cultivators behind Feng Haoyu had also begun to condense their spirit fires and proceed with the steps of warming the cauldron. Shui looked at Su Zimo and said, "Junior brother Su, let's begin." "Alright," Su Zimo nodded. Shui extended his palm and a ball of flame rose from it. Even though it was a level 1 spirit fire, its color was a little dark, and it was showing signs of evolving into a level 2 spirit fire. The step of warming the cauldron did not require concentration. Shui circled the spirit fire around the weapon tripod before placing it below. He turned to look at Su Zimo, thinking that this junior brother of his might be unfamiliar with weapon refinement since he had just come into contact with it. Perhaps he could give him some pointers. The moment Shui turned his head, he froze on the spot. There was a ball of flame burning in Su Zimo's palm that was so red that it was blinding. Shui was completely dumbfounded and his mind went blank. He did not even notice that the flame beneath the weapon tripod before him was extinguished. Mimicking the others, Su Zimo burned the spirit fire around the weapon tripod before placing it beneath the tripod. The step of warming the cauldron was not mentioned in the explanations of the inner sect disciples in the past. For the past month, Su Zimo had not tried warming the cauldron even when he was in seclusion cultivation. "I didn't come for nothing this time round's test. Indeed, I gained something." Su Zimo was secretly delighted. Su junior brother Su, your spiritual fire." Right then Shui's stuttering voice sounded in Su Zimo's ears with a hint of trembling. Su Zimo turned his head and smiled. "I was just lucky to cultivate a level 3 spirit fire in a daze." Su Zimo was not being humble. He truly cultivated it in a daze and did not know the reason why even now. Shui's eyes widened and his mouth was agape, his jaw almost dropping to the ground. This was the first time he had heard that a level 3 spirit fire was cultivated in a daze through luck. Their voices were not loud, but the surrounding disciples could hear them clearly. "Level 3 spirit fire? Dream on." The few disciples at the front turned back and were dumbfounded as well. A strange atmosphere gradually spread through the entire hall. Feng Haoyu, who was standing at the front, seemed to have sensed something as he frowned slightly. However, he did not turn back out of pride. In this hall, no one was worthy of his attention. Right then, a piercing shriek broke the strange atmosphere in the hall. Level 3 Spirit Fire. After that shriek, the hall was in an uproar. Scarlet. It's really a level 3 Spirit Fire. Who is that? He looks unfamiliar. Why haven't I seen him before? He seems to be a new disciple this year. This is unbelievable. He's only a level 5 Qi refinement warrior, and yet he managed to cultivate a level 3 Spirit Fire. What sort of talent is that? When he heard the discussions behind him, Feng Haoyu's expression darkened. After standing still for a moment, Feng Haoyu's expression returned to normal. His eyes were calm as he turned around slowly and looked behind. That ball of crimson flame was the first thing that came into view. Right after, it was a familiar green robe and a handsome face. It's him again. Feng Haoyu narrowed his eyes as a cold glint flashed in the depths of his eyes. Su Zimo, who was initially warming the tripod, felt a sudden sense of enmity and looked up instinctively. What sharp senses! Feng Haoyu was secretly shocked. He had already concealed his enmity well. To think that it would still attract Su Zimo's attention. Their gazes met in midair. Feng Haoyu's expression was unchanged as he turned around arrogantly. On the surface, it seemed as though he did not take that to heart. However, the level 2 spirit fire beneath his weapon tripod was already extinguished. It was clear how shocked he was. Su Zimo smiled and did not think much about it. Seeing that the weapon tripod was already warm and he was about to place the selected materials in, a disheveled head suddenly appeared beside him. Shocked, Su Zimo retrieved the cold moon saber from his storage bag and almost slashed over. Greetings, Master. Greetings, Peak Master. When the disciples in the hall saw who it was, they greeted one after another. Su Zimo coughed gently and stuffed the cold moon saber back without a trace. Chapter 77. Unknowingly, Weapon Peak's master, the disheveled old man, had arrived at the weapon refinement hall and was standing beside Su Zimo. Glancing at the cold moon saber that Su Zimo had just returned, the disheveled old man asked in a seemingly casual manner, "Lad, why do you have to stab someone at the slightest disagreement?" When he entered the sect, Su Zimo had just exited the illusion on the peak of the front mountain when he slashed at Weapon Peak's master. Just now, he had nearly slashed at Weapon Peak's master's head once more. With an awkward expression, Su Zimo was about to retract his spirit fire and apologize to his master. Unexpectedly, the disheveled old man waved it off hurriedly and raised his head. "It's fine, continue refining. I'll watch from the side. Don't feel pressured." "Alright," Su Zimo nodded in response. Pausing for a moment, the disheveled old man patted Su Zimo on the shoulder and said earnestly, "Lad, you don't have to be so tense in our ethereal sect. Relax, no one will harm you. Don't draw your saber for no reason." In reality, Su Zimo's reaction was something that he had trained in Songlang mountain range and was already a habit. Outside the mountain range, all the birds and beasts were Su Zimo's enemies. Back in the cave, he still had to be wary of the spirit monkey's sneak attacks, and that was why he was acting so jittery. However, Su Zimo did not let down his guard just because of the disheveled old man's words. While he should be more careful in the future and try not to draw his saber, he still had to be careful. The disheveled old man continued, "Furthermore, even if you draw your saber, you have to look at who you're dealing with. You've only been in the sect for a month and you've already drawn your saber on 2 peak masters. What will happen if you stay here for too long?" Cough cough. "I'll be more careful in the future." Su Zimo smiled embarrassedly. None of the peak masters would appear for a test like this at the end of the month, let alone Weapon Peak's master who was known for his laziness. Now that the disheveled old man had appeared in the weapon refinement hall, everyone knew the reason. It was definitely not for Feng Haoyu but for Su Zimo. At this moment Feng Haoyu, who was standing at the front, felt his face burning. However, his back was facing the crowd, so no one could see the coldness in his eyes. Feng Haoyu calmed his mind and began to warm the cauldron again. At the back of the main hall, Suzimo's level 3 spirit fire had never stopped. At this moment, he had already begun to put in the spiritual materials. Numerous spirit materials entered the cauldron. Suzimo increased the circulation of his spirit chi and the flames blazed, enveloping the entire weapon cauldron in an instant. The temperature within the cauldron continued to rise. The step of smelting was to use high temperatures to melt all kinds of spirit materials into liquid form, and then fuse them together, refining the impurities in the spirit materials as much as possible. This step had nothing to do with artifact refinement techniques. It was the step that best reflected the difference in the level of the spirit fire. Even if it was a level 2 spirit fire controlled by a senior weapon refinement master, in terms of refining impurities, it would not be able to compare to a level 3 spirit fire controlled by a novice. Not long after, the various spiritual materials in the cauldron began to melt. In the end, they were refined into a large mass of liquid metal, releasing traces of spiritual energy. The level 3 spirit fire continued to burn. The mass of liquid metal bubbled within the cauldron, and the spirit chi in the cauldron gradually thickened. When he saw that, a smile flashed through the disheveled old man's eyes as he nodded. The liquid metal was bright red and gradually shrank under the continuous roasting. That was because some of the impurities were being refined. 15 minutes later, the volume of the liquid metal finally stopped shrinking. This did not mean that there were no impurities in the liquid metal. It was merely the limit of what a level 3 spirit fire could refine. The smelting was over. At that moment, the spiritual materials in the weapon cauldrons of the other disciples had just melted. Feng Haoyu was the only one who was slightly faster, and a large mass of liquid metal appeared in his cauldron. Not only was the level 3 spirit fire more effective in refining impurities, it was also faster and was far ahead of others. The next step was forging. Suzimo retracted his spirit fire and waited for the temperature in the cauldron to drop while regulating his breathing to recover the spirit chi that just now had expended. Forging required one to circulate their spirit chi and form a pair of spirit hands that would reach into the weapon cauldron. Before the liquid metal solidified, they would have to create the shape of the weapon they wanted. If they entered too early and the temperature in the cauldron was too high, not only would the spirit hands dissipate easily, it would be difficult for the forging to succeed before the liquid metal cooled down completely. However, if they entered too late and the liquid metal solidified completely, it would be even more impossible to forge. This step was a test of experience. After an incense stick's time, Suzimo suddenly stood up and circulated his spirit chi furiously. Forming a pair of hands in midair, he reached into the weapon cauldron and grabbed the liquid metal. At that moment, the liquid metal was neither hard nor soft and had yet to solidify completely. The timing was perfect. The disheveled old man looked at the focused Suzimo from the side and was increasingly satisfied. Bloody hell! I've really picked up a treasure. If not for the fact that there were so many sect disciples around, the disheveled old man would have hugged Suzimo and kissed him fiercely. For some reason, Suzimo suddenly felt a chill and could not help but shudder. A moment later, a flying sword was gradually formed. The sword was slender and did not have a sharp edge. The shape of the sword was just beginning to appear. At that moment, many disciples in the weapon refinement hall gave up on the test and focused on Suzimo's weapon refinement process. When they noticed the sword shape that Suzimo had created, the crowd could not help but hiss. At that moment, Feng Haoyu was already done with the smelting and was waiting for the weapon cauldron to cool down. Sitting on the spot, he could not help but turn back when he sensed the commotion in the crowd. When he saw the sword shape in Suzimo's weapon cauldron, Feng Haoyu sneered and turned back. After the forging was done, Suzimo could naturally sense the abnormality in the crowd. "Master, did I make a mistake?" Suzimo could not help but ask. The disheveled old man waved it off and said nonchalantly, "It's not a big mistake. You grasped the timing of the forging very well. It's just that there's a problem with the sword shape. There's an additional hilt." An additional hilt? Suzimo froze for a moment with a confused look in his eyes. The disheveled old man asked, "Do you know why most cultivators' flying swords don't come with a hilt?" Suzimo shook his head. The disheveled old man said, "Flying swords are the most common Dharma treasures in the cultivation world. They have blades on both sides, are fast, agile and have a variety of attacks. Unlike ordinary swords, flying swords do not come with a hilt. With an additional hilt, the air resistance of the flying sword in the air will increase, reducing its agility and speed. A look of realization flashed through Suzumo's eyes. In the past, when he cultivated as a demon, he had always been fighting in melee combat. Now that he had only been in contact with immortal cultivation for a month, he had barely practiced sword kinesis. After all, immortal cultivation was different from demonic cultivation. Cultivators did not use flying swords to fight their enemies. Instead, they used spirit chi to form a threat to control the flying sword from afar. In a fight, if the flying sword pierced the opponent, it would be stuck in the opponent's body if the hilt came with it. However, if there was no hilt, the flying sword could pierce through the opponent with ease and continue to be controlled without being affected. If the other party cultivated body tempering techniques and had a strong physique, the flying sword with a hilt would fall into the hands of the other party more easily. However, if the flying sword did not have a hilt and was all sharp, the opponent would not be able to grab it bare-handed. For a flying sword, a hilt was only a burden. Chapter 78. The disheveled old man consoled. That's just a small mistake. Just be more careful in the future. Don't be discouraged. Suzumo nodded. No matter the outcome, his trip today was not in vain. Although the forging step seemed simple, there were many considerations in terms of the shape of the spirit weapon. One had to maximize the power of the weapon. Fourth step, tempering. The forged flying sword hovered in the weapon tripod and Suzumo released his level 3 spirit fire once more to heat it up. For this step, the temperature had to be controlled well. It couldn't be too high or the flying sword would melt easily. It couldn't be too low either or it wouldn't be able to achieve the effect of tempering or sharpening. It was best to burn the spirit weapon to a scarlet and transparent state. For the past month, Suzumo had failed countless times in the tempering step alone. A moment later, the flying sword gradually turned red in the weapon tripod. Under the continuous roasting of the flames, the sword shone with a crystalline red glow. Suzumo controlled the flying sword and placed it at the bottom of the tripod. Conjuring a hammer with spirit chi, he began hammering on it. Clanging sounds rang out continuously. After tempering, not only could more impurities be removed, the sword would also become tougher. Among the 6 steps of weapon refinement, this step required the most skill and every weapon refinement master had a different tempering technique. Suzumo merely hammered on the sword bit by bit with brute force. The disheveled old man frowned. Suzumo's tempering technique was way too crude, and was no different from the blacksmithing of the mortal world. At the same time, Feng Haoyu began tempering the flying sword as well. Unlike Suzumo, Feng Haoyu's tempering technique was much more brilliant. Feng Haoyu had a wind spirit root and could conjure a wind hammer. As he hammered on the flying sword, he infused a trace of wind spirit chi into it. As such, the refined flying sword would be more agile and faster. As he hammered, the edge of the sword was gradually revealed. Feng Haoyu's tempering technique was clearly very proficient and his speed was even faster. He was already catching up to Suzumo. After an incense stick's time, Suzumo heaved a long sigh of relief. Tempering complete. If he wanted to forge a pseudo-spiritual weapon, he could directly put the red-hot flying sword into cold water and quench it. However, Suzumo's heart skipped a beat. Since the flying sword had a hilt, it wasn't perfect to begin with. Why not try spirit gathering? In the past month, Suzumo had already destroyed dozens of flying swords in the spirit gathering step. None of them had been successful. According to some of the inner disciples who taught about smithing, there was no technique involved in spirit gathering. It was more like trying one's luck. If one was lucky, one would succeed in spirit gathering. Of course, this was under the premise that the first 4 steps were not too big of a problem. After the tempering, Suzumo did not move the flying sword out of the weapon tripod. Instead, he stared at the spirit energy within the tripod with bright eyes. Could it be that he wants to gather spirit? If the spirit gathering succeeds, it will be incredible. Humph. He's only been in the art of refining for a month and he's already dreaming of gathering spirit energy. I think he doesn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. A series of discussions broke out around him. Some were shocked while some were mocking. Suzumo tossed aside all distracting thoughts and calmed down. This was a step that required the full concentration of a weapon refinement master, without any distractions. Taking a deep breath of air, Su Zimo controlled the spirit energy within the tripod and slowly channeled it towards the scarlet flying sword. Under the constant pressure, a faint pattern appeared on the sword. It was faint and barely visible, as it had yet to truly take shape. Look, a spirit pattern. It's really a spirit pattern, but it's not formed yet. Could he really be able to create an inferior grade flying sword? At that moment, Feng Haoyu had just finished his tempering as well. When he heard the discussions in the crowd, his heart sank as he glanced sideways at Su Zimo. If Su Zimo was truly able to create an inferior grade spirit weapon, he could only take a gamble and attempt spirit gathering. However, Feng Haoyu was not confident. Spirit gathering was way too difficult and he had never succeeded before. The disheveled old man narrowed his eyes and stared fixedly at the flying sword within the tripod. His palms were sweating. He was even more nervous than Su Zimo. Piak. Right then, a crisp sound echoed from Su Zimo's weapon tripod. It's over. Su Zimo knew that things were bad. Immediately after, the flying sword exploded with a bang, and the shard struck the weapon tripod with a loud bang. He had failed. That was to be expected. Su Zimo shook his head gently and laughed in a self-deprecating manner. The disheveled old man sighed gently. Shui looked regretful at the side as well. When Feng Haoyu saw that, he was finally relieved. Even though Su Zimo's flying sword had exploded, Feng Haoyu did not intend to attempt spirit gathering. Instead, he took out the pseudo-spirit weapon from the tripod and placed it in cold water. Sizzle. A thick white smoke rose from the basin. The flying sword was successfully refined and revealed a chilling aura that was extremely sharp. Feng Haoyu placed the flying sword on the table in front of him and waited for the final evaluation. Su Zimo had just put away the weapon tripod when he heard a voice in the hall. In the 6 steps of weapon refinement, the grade of spirit fire isn't the only thing. Don't think that you can become a weapon refinement master just because you've cultivated a level 3 spirit fire. Su Zimo turned towards the voice and met with Feng Haoyu's cold and provocative gaze. Feng Haoyu said with a fake smile, "Junior brother Su, you have to walk the path step by step with your feet on the ground. If you run without knowing how to walk, it's easy to fall." Su Zimo furrowed his brows slightly. The two of them had only met a few times and had never spoken to each other. Even though they did not have any grudges, for some reason, Feng Haoyu was extremely hostile towards him. Especially today. That's right. Well said, junior brother Feng. Fufu, you're getting cocky just because you've cultivated a level 3 spirit fire. That's called overestimating yourself. The people who spoke were not from Weapon Peak, but disciples of Spirit Peak who were here for the test. Naturally, they would not miss the opportunity to suppress Su Zimo and get into Feng Haoyu's good books. Cut the sarcasm. Go back and cultivate a level 3 spirit fire first. Shui could not help but stand out and scoff coldly. Many disciples of Spirit Peak were speechless as their expressions turned terrible. No matter what, even if Su Zimo failed in spirit gathering, it was a fact that he had cultivated a level 3 spirit fire and no one in the 5 peaks could compare to him. Feng Haoyu continued, "Junior brother Su, don't take this failure to heart. There's still the 5 peaks face-off at the end of the year. I hope that you'll be able to defeat me by then." Su Zimo looked at Feng Haoyu indifferently without replying. The disheveled old man watched everything from the side without saying anything. As a senior of the sect, he naturally would not interfere in a quarrel between disciples. After a while, the disciple in charge of the test declared, "Even though all of you have refined pseudo-spirit weapons, the flying swords refined by Feng Haoyu of Spirit Peak are of better quality and faster. Therefore, the number 1 of the end-of-the-month test is Feng Haoyu." Many disciples of Spirit Peak cheered. Feng Haoyu smiled gently and swept his gaze across Su Zimo before turning to the disheveled old man. Bowing slightly, he said, "Peak Master, please bring me to the images left behind by the seniors of the sect." "Yes." The disheveled old man nodded expressionlessly. "You're number 1, of course you're qualified." With that said, the disheveled old man tugged at Su Zimo's arm and said casually, "Let's go, lad. You can go take a look as well." Su Zimo froze for a moment. Frowning, Feng Haoyu said in a deep voice, "Su Zimo failed in his weapon refinement and is not even ranked in the end-of-the-month test. He's not qualified to watch the images at all. Isn't this inappropriate, Peak Master?" Indeed, it's inappropriate. The disheveled old man nodded in a serious manner before smirking. But I'm happy to.